Silas Vane didn't knock. He never knocked. Men like him didn't bother with courtesy when they believed the world already owed them entry. He shoved open the door to the Territorial Land Office in Harwick, Wyoming, dropped a leather satchel onto the clerk's desk, hard enough to scatter papers, and planted both hands flat on the surface, like he was staking a claim right there on the furniture. "The Cinder Ridge property," he said. "It went to auction this morning. I want to know who bought it." The clerk, young, nervous, barely 20, fumbled through his ledger. "Sir, the auction was open to the public. The deed transferred legally to—" "I didn't ask you whether it was legal." Vane's voice dropped to something quieter and far more dangerous. "I ask you who bought it." The clerk swallowed. His finger found the line. "A woman, sir, name of Marlowe, Adeline Marlowe. She paid $1. The silence that followed was the kind that made rooms feel smaller. Silas Vane picked up his satchel, buttoned his coat, and walked out without another word. But the clerk noticed his jaw had gone tight enough to crack a tooth. If you've ever watched something you worked your whole life for get sold out from under you for the price of a penny candy, you already know what this story is about. Subscribe to the channel and follow Adeline's journey all the way to the end, because the stories we share here don't go the way you expect. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Adeline Marlowe had made exactly one impulsive decision in her entire adult life. She was standing in the middle of it. The wagon had stopped at the top of a low ridge, and from there she could see Cinder Ridge spread out below her. In the late afternoon gray, a cluster of weathered structures, dead fence lines, and pasture that had forgotten what grass looked like. The well cover sat crooked. The barn leaned to the south like it had been shoved hard and never quite recovered. The main house, a modest two-room affair with a covered porch, had a section of roof missing above the far corner, replaced by what appeared to be flattened tin cans, hammered flat and nailed over the gap. The man who'd driven her wagon from Harwick, a laconic hauler named Cobb, who'd agreed to carry her trunk for 50 cents, cleared his throat. "You said you wanted Cinder Ridge." "I did. That's it." "Yes." Adeline kept her voice steady. "I can see that." "Sold at auction this morning for $1. Cobb glanced sideways at her. "You knew about the condition before you bid. I had a description." "What description?" "It said foreclosed ranch property with existing structures." Cobb made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Existing is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Adeline picked up her bag from the footboard and climbed down from the wagon without assistance, which she'd been doing for the past 6 years out of habit rather than pride. She landed in mud that tried to keep her boot, released it with an undignified sucking noise, and she squared her shoulders anyway. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Cobb. You want me to wait? See if you change your mind?" "No." She started down toward the property. "I won't." She heard him click his tongue at the horses and turn the wagon around. She didn't look back. The walk down took longer than she'd expected because the path had rutted badly and the light was already starting to thin toward dusk. By the time she reached the house, pushed open the door, it caught on a warped board and required a full-body lean and lit the oil lamp she'd packed in her trunk's outer pocket. The light outside had turned the color of old dishwater. She stood in the center of the main room and took stock. Bare floor, cracked in 2 places near the stove. A table with 3 legs and a brick doing the fourth's work. A wood stove that looked sound, but hadn't been lit in months, judging by the layer of dust on the grate. Cobwebs in every corner. A smell that was earth and old leather, and something dead that had been dead long enough to finish smelling like itself and start smelling like nothing at all. On the wall, someone had driven a nail and hung a child's drawing of a horse, faded to near invisibility. Adeline set her lamp on the 3-legged table, braced it so it wouldn't tip, and stood there for a long moment. 12 years she'd been a schoolmistress in Cheyenne, teaching other people's children their letters and their sums. 7 of those same 12 years, she'd also kept the books for the Harwick Cooperative Savings and Loan, 3 mornings a week, before it folded under circumstances that still made her stomach tighten when she thought about them. She'd saved carefully. She'd spent almost nothing. She had eaten beans more weeks than she cared to remember, and she had done it because she'd known that somewhere, at some point, there would be a moment when the money she'd saved would buy her something that was entirely, irrevocably hers. She looked at the brick holding up the table. The moment was apparently this. She heard the noise from the barn at roughly 9 o'clock. It wasn't dramatic, no crashing, no voices, just a shift of weight on old wood. A sound that didn't belong to wind. Adeline had been trying to get the wood stove to draw properly, and she stopped, listening with the iron poker still in her hand. Could have convinced herself it was an animal. She almost did. But it came again, heavier this time, the deliberate weight of something with 2 feet rather than 4. She picked up her lantern in her left hand. She kept the poker in her right. She'd had exactly 0 experience with confronting people in dark barns, but she'd also taught 17-year-old boys who thought they were men, and she'd learned early that the only thing worse than walking towards something uncertain was standing still and letting it come to you. She pushed open the barn door and held the lantern up. A man was pushing himself upright from a pile of old hay in the near corner, blinking against the sudden light. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed, with several days of dark beard and the kind of hollow look around the eyes that comes from more missed meals than a person could conveniently count. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, and moving stiffly. The cold had settled into him while he slept. His coat was adequate once upon a time. Right now it was losing the argument with November. He held one hand up, shielding his eyes from the lantern. "I'm not armed," he said, voice rough like he hadn't used it much lately. "That's very reassuring," Adeline said, and was quietly proud that her voice didn't shake. "Who are you?" "Ronan Hale." He said it the way people say their name when they're not sure it'll mean anything good. "I've been using this barn. I didn't know anyone had—" He stopped, looked around at the space like he was recalibrating. "Someone bought it?" "I did." A pause. "You?" "Yes." Adeline kept the poker visible but not raised. "Me." Ronan Hale put his hand down and looked at her properly for the first time. The lantern light moved between them. "This was my family's ranch," he said. 3 generations. My grandfather built that barn you're standing in." The words landed with weight she hadn't expected. She kept her expression neutral. "When did you lose it?" 8 months ago. Foreclosure. Something moved through his face that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was the place those two things go when they've been living together long enough to become something harder and quieter. Drought killed the cattle. Loans killed the rest. Adeline reached into her coat pocket and produced the deed folded twice, slightly damp at the edges from the day's cold, and absolutely, unambiguously signed, recorded, and stamped by the Territorial Land Office. She held it up toward the lantern so he could see it without her crossing the distance between them. He read it from where he stood. She watched his face work through it, the date, the price, the name at the bottom. $1, he said. It was the auction price. "You bought my family's ranch for $1. She looked past him at the barn, the leaning walls, the gaps between the boards where wind got through, the empty stalls, the hayloft with its missing rail. "Then help me make it worth more than 1, she said. Ronan Hale looked at her like she'd said something in a language he didn't quite speak. The silence stretched between them, cold and particular. "You're not calling the sheriff," he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "You haven't given me a reason to." She lowered the poker slightly. "You're trespassing, but you're not threatening. There's a difference. Most people wouldn't bother making it. Most people didn't buy a broken ranch at the edge of winter with money they spent 12 years saving." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not most people." Another silence. Outside, the wind picked up and the barn walls groaned softly under it. A loose board somewhere above them rattled in its frame. Ronan looked up at the sound, and she could see the reflex in him, the automatic assessment of a man checking structural integrity, a man who'd built and repaired things all his life and hadn't yet unlearned the habit. "The north wall's going to give before spring, if it isn't reinforced," he said, almost to himself. "I know." He looked at her. I can see it's leaning. "I don't know how to fix it, but I can see the problem." She paused. "Can you fix it?" "I've fixed worse. And the well. The water tastes wrong, like something died near the shaft." Ronan winced a small involuntary thing. There was a sinkhole problem on the eastern side 2 years before the foreclosure. "I was going to dig a secondary channel, but the drought accelerated, and I ran out of time and money at the same time." He stopped, seemed to realize how much he was saying and why. "Why are you asking me this?" Adeline lowered the poker fully and held it at her side. "I'm going to make you an offer," she said. "You can refuse it. If you do, I'll ask you to be off the property by morning, and I won't involve the sheriff as long as you go peacefully. But I want you to hear it first." He said nothing. She took that as permission. 30 days, she said. "You help me get this property through winter fence repairs. The well, the barn, Whatever needs doing to keep the livestock I'm expecting next week from dying. In exchange, you sleep in this barn, eat at that table, and I pay you $6 when the 30 days are done." She met his eyes. "After 30 days, we see where we are." Ronan stared at her. "You're offering to pay me to work my own family's ranch." "I'm offering to pay you to work my ranch," she said, without cruelty but without apology either. "Those are different things." He opened his mouth, closed it, looked away. She could see the muscle in his jaw working. $6, he said, $6 in a roof. It's November in Wyoming. He looked up at that roof, his grandfather's roof. She could see him thinking it, and she watched the particular defeat of a man choosing survival over pride, and she didn't look away from it because looking away would have been worse. "All right," he said. 30 days, she agreed. She turned to go back to the house and stopped at the barn door. "There's a cot in the storage room at the back. It's better than the hay." She pulled the door open against the wind. "And tomorrow I'll need you to show me where that sinkhole is." Walked back to the house. Behind her, through the wind, she heard him moving toward the storage room. Put the poker back next to the stove and sat down at the three-legged table and let herself shake for approximately 45 seconds. Then she opened her ledger, uncapped her pen, and wrote the date at the top of a clean page. Day 1. She was going to need to know what she was working with. The next morning arrived with the particular cruelty of late Wyoming autumn gray, iron-edged, with a wind that got inside your coat no matter how you'd buttoned it. Adeline was already up when Ronan emerged from the barn, which she could tell surprised him, even if he didn't show it. She had managed to get the wood stove lit the night before and had made coffee real coffee, not chicory, because she'd decided that if she was going to live hard, she was at least going to drink well. And she had a cup waiting on the porch railing when he crossed the yard. He stopped when he saw it. "I didn't know if you took it black," she said, "so I left the milk inside. There isn't much. Black's fine." He took the cup and drank, and some of the morning stiffness went out of his posture. He looked out over the yard, the dead grass, the collapsed section of fence along the south side, the well with its tilted cover, and his face did something complicated and brief. "Where do you want to start?" he said. "The well. If the water's bad, nothing else matters." He nodded, already moving. Over the next 4 hours, Adeline learned several things about Ronan Hale. He didn't explain himself while he worked, but he answered direct questions directly. He'd been ranching this land since he was 11 years old, working beside his father until his father's back gave out, and then alone when his father died. He had no siblings. His mother had passed when he was young enough that he struggled to remember her face clearly and seemed to resent that fact on a level he'd stopped examining. He'd married once, briefly, a woman named Clara, who'd left during the second bad drought year because she'd decided she hadn't signed up to watch a ranch die, and he'd decided she wasn't wrong. He didn't say any of this in a single conversation. He said it in pieces, dropped between measurements and decisions, the way people share things when they're moving and can't maintain the full attention it would take to be guarded. Adeline filed all of it away. The well problem was both simpler and more expensive than she'd feared. Simpler because it was identifiable runoff from a decomposed animal carcass. Somewhere upslope had found a crack in the shaft lining and tainted the upper water. More expensive because fixing it properly meant pulling the existing stone lining in the top 8 feet and relaying it with mortar. "I can do the work," Ronan said, crouched at the well's edge, looking down with a hand sheltering his eyes from the flat morning light. "But the mortar and stone will cost." How much, he thought. $3, maybe $4, depending what they're charging at the Harwick Supply. She wrote it down. She was writing everything down. They ate at noon salt pork and cold biscuits she'd brought in her provisions trunk, sitting on opposite ends of the porch, because the inside table was still operating on 3 legs and a prayer. The silence between them was not comfortable, exactly, but it was functional. Both of them were people who'd spent considerable time alone, and they'd both made a separate peace with quiet. It was Ronan who broke it. "Where'd you come from?" He wasn't looking at her. He was eating and watching the pasture's south tree line, checking for something she didn't have the experience yet to identify. Cheyenne, mostly. Before that, Ohio. Ohio. He said it the way Western people often said Eastern place names, not quite dismissive, but with a recognition that it might as well be another country. "My father's farm, corn." She broke a biscuit in half. "I left when I was 19. Ran away, walked away." "There's a difference." She paused. He wanted me to marry someone I didn't want to marry, and when I declined, he told me I'd come back when I was finished being stupid. Ronan said nothing for a moment. 12 years teaching school, he said. That's what you did instead. That and bookkeeping. The school paid in purpose. Bookkeeping paid in dollars. She looked out at the pasture. I saved enough to buy this place. For $1. For $1, she agreed. But I also have enough for the mortar and stone, and whatever else we need to get through winter, if we're careful. He glanced at her sideways. How careful? Very. He looked back at the pasture. The north fence is worse than the barn, he said. 2 sections have come down entirely. If you're putting livestock in that pasture, you need at least the northern quarter fenced solid, or you'll spend every morning chasing stock into the next county. Can we do both? The well and the fence, not in the same week. Not with 2 people, he set down the tin plate. Well, first, water first, always. Then the fence. She nodded and wrote that down too. The livestock arrived 3 days later, which was earlier than she'd told Ronan, and earlier than she'd wanted a miscommunication with the seller in Harwick. That cost her half a day of panic and 1 emergency fence repair that required both of them in the field, until the last of the gray afternoon light gave out. When the final post was set and the wire strung and the 4 young steers were contained in the northern quarter, looking confused and cold, Ronan leaned against the fence post and looked at her. She was breathing hard. Her hands were bleeding from the wire. She'd been wearing the wrong gloves and hadn't realized it until the 3rd post. He looked at her hands, then away. Go get that cleaned up, he said. In a minute now. Wire cuts in this cold can turn bad fast. She started to argue. The instinct was immediate, automatic. 12 years of managing her own problems without instruction, and then she looked at her left palm and decided he wasn't wrong. I'll be back in 20 minutes, she said. Take 30. Took 25. When she came back out, he'd fed the steers and checked the water trough and was restringing the wire section. She'd done poorly not tearing it out, just tightening and correcting, which she appreciated more than if he'd redone it entirely. You could have said it was wrong while I was doing it, she said. You were concentrating. That's a diplomatic way to put it. It wasn't wrong enough to be dangerous, he said. Just loose. Loose is fixable. She looked at the section he'd corrected and then at the remaining fence line stretching north. How long to do the whole northern quarter? 3 more days. The weather holds, and if it doesn't, he looked at the sky. It had that loaded quality, gray-white and heavy, then longer. The weather didn't hold. The 2nd week opened with 4 days of freezing rain that made outdoor work treacherous and indoor work limited by the fact that the main house's roof, the patched corner with the flattened tin cans, leaked in 2 places when rain came in at an angle, and the angle it came in at for 3 of those 4 days was exactly wrong. Adeline moved her trunk, her records, and her sleeping pallet to the center of the main room and managed the drip with 2 pots she rotated when they filled. Ronan spent one of the freezing rain days reinforcing the barn's north wall. From the inside she could hear him working, the sound of hammer and nail coming through the wet gray air, and the other days doing something with the roof of the storage room that she gathered from the sounds involved significant cursing and at least 1 near miss with a laugh. On the evening of the 3rd day, she brought him his supper in the barn because the rain was at its worst, and she decided she could either make him walk through it or carry a covered plate 30 feet. She brought the plate. He was sitting on an overturned crate, hands wrapped around a tin cup of something hot she hadn't provided, which meant he'd rigged some kind of heating arrangement in the storage room. You have a stove in there? Brazier, he said. Brought it from... He stopped. Started over. It was in the storage room already. Back of the shelf. She'd learned by now that he sometimes started to say, I brought it, or I put it there, and caught himself, because all of those sentences ended with the reminder that this had been his place. She'd started to notice when it happened and stopped commenting on it. She set the plate down on the crate beside him. The north wall's solid now, he said, not looking at her. The bracing I added will hold through spring. After that, you'll want to address the foundation on the east side. There's settling that's going to cause problems in another year or 2. I'll put it in the ledger. There's a ledger? There's always a ledger. She looked around the barn. He'd done something with the empty stalls, 2 cleared debris, relayed the old straw, repaired a broken hinge on the near stall door. I keep records. Costs, repairs needed, work completed. Timeline. Ronan looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one where he was adjusting his estimation of her upward and was slightly annoyed about it. Most ranchers, I know, don't bother with records until they're in trouble. Most ranchers I know lose their ranches, she said. Beat. She realized what she'd said 1/2 second after she said it. I didn't mean...
No, you're right.
He picked up the tin cup again. That's exactly what happened. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. It had texture, something under the surface of it. The loans, she said carefully. The ones that took the ranch. What were the terms? He looked at her. I'm a bookkeeper, she said. I'm asking because I keep records. I want to understand what happened here. Why? Because this is my ranch now, and I want to know what almost killed it. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Initial loan was $40, 2-year term, interest at 8% per annum, which was high but not criminal given the drought conditions. He recited it like a ledger entry, flat, precise. I made 12 payments, every one of them. I have the receipts. The last sentence had something under it that wasn't quite bitterness and wasn't quite pride. When I went to reconcile at the 14-month mark, I was told my total outstanding had increased by 60%. Adeline kept her face still, 60%. The man at the loan office, Vane's man, name of Greer, told me there had been a recalculation of the interest structure and additional penalties for what he called payment irregularities. I showed him my receipts. He said receipts weren't the official record, and the official record showed what? I'd missed 3 payments. Ronan's voice was very flat now. I hadn't missed any. Adeline said nothing. By the time I could get anyone with authority to look at it, the default process had started. I couldn't stop it, couldn't get anyone to listen. He looked down at the tin cup. My grandfather built this barn. My father ran 300 head of cattle in that north pasture. And I lost it because some man's bookkeeper decided to write down numbers that weren't real. Adeline sat with that for a moment. Do you still have the receipts? What? Your payment receipts. The ones you showed Greer. He stared at her. Yeah, I have them, in my pack. I want to see them, she said, not tonight, but soon. Why? Because I told you I keep records, she said, and I want to know if what I'm thinking is the same as what you're thinking. She picked up his empty supper plate and walked back to the house through the freezing rain. Behind her, she heard him say something she didn't quite catch, and she decided it was probably better that she hadn't. It was on the 11th day, the rain finally gone, the sky scrubbed clean and bitter cold, that the steer nearly killed her. She'd gone into the north pasture alone because Ronan was at the supply house in Harwick, gone since before dawn to pick up the mortar they needed for the well project. She'd meant to check the water trough and look at the fence section on the far northeast corner that she thought might be loosening. The steer came out of nowhere, or rather, it came from the place where nothing had been, and then suddenly everything was, the animal startled by something, a sound, a shadow, she never knew what, and it turned hard and charged. Not at her specifically, just forward, which happened to be where she was. She had approximately 2 seconds of understanding before it hit her, and she used those seconds to dodge right and get clear of the full impact. But the shoulder caught her, and the ground came up hard, and she skidded through frosted grass on her hands and knees, with the breath knocked completely out of her body. She was still trying to get it back when Ronan appeared. She didn't hear him arrive, couldn't hear much of anything, with her ears ringing, and her lungs staged a labor dispute, but he was there. Suddenly, between her and the steer, moving the animal back with his body and his voice, not running it, just redirecting it, the way someone does when they've been doing it their whole life and their body knows the geometry before their mind has to think. The steer shied left and moved off, confused and grumbling. Ronan turned around. She was on her knees, hands flat on the frozen ground, breathing in short, careful increments. Don't, she said before he could speak. She held up one hand. He stopped. She got her breathing back. It took longer than she wanted. When she finally pushed herself upright, she was unsteady for a moment, and she hated that, and she could see in his face that he'd registered it and was choosing not to comment, which she appreciated, so intensely she almost said so. What are you doing back early? She asked instead. Miller was already loaded and I didn't have to wait. He was looking her over not obtrusively, but systematically. Can you walk? She walked forward 3 steps. Her right knee was complaining and her palms were scraped raw, but she was upright and level. Yes. Anything feel wrong? Ribs? She pressed a careful hand to her side. Bruised maybe. Nothing broken. He said nothing for a moment. You shouldn't be in the pasture alone with the steers yet, he said carefully. I know that now. You should have known it before. She met his eyes. I should have. He held her gaze, seemed to find what he was looking for, and turned toward the fence line she'd been heading for. "Come on," he said. "Show me the section you were worried about." They walked the fence together. He found 3 loose posts she'd missed and one she'd seen but hadn't correctly identified as urgent. He didn't lecture. He explained, briefly, what he was looking at and why it mattered. And she asked 2 questions, and he answered them. And by the time they'd walked the full northeast section, she understood something about fence mechanics she hadn't understood before. On the walk back, he said, without preamble, "Next time you go in with the steers, you tell me. You won't always be here, no. But when I am, you tell me." He paused. "And if I'm not here, you take the pole with you. Not the iron one, the long one in the barn. It's specifically for moving stock." She filed this away. "All right," she said. Neither of them mentioned the steer incident again. It was the 15th day when Silas Vane rode in. She was on the porch with her ledger when she saw him coming up the access track, a well-dressed man on a well-maintained horse, which already told her something. Men who showed up at struggling frontier properties on expensive horses either wanted to buy something or collect something. Ronan was behind the barn. She didn't call for him. Vane rode to the edge of the porch yard and reined in without dismounting, which was its own kind of statement. He was maybe 50, gray at the temples, with the kind of groomed face that suggested someone else had always done his hard work for him. He had pleasant eyes, which she distrusted immediately, because pleasant eyes were what men cultivated when they didn't want you to look at their hands. "Miss Marlowe," he said, "name's Vane, Silas Vane. I represent several land interests in this valley." "Mr. Vane," she didn't stand. "What can I do for you?" "I heard about your purchase." He smiled. "Brave acquisition. Difficult land. Most worth-having things are." "Quite right." The smile held, but something behind it didn't quite. "I wanted to offer you a way out before winter got much worse. I'd be prepared to buy Cinder Ridge from you today for $50. $50 for a property she'd paid $1 for. She kept her expression neutral and ran the numbers fast, the way she'd learned to do with ledgers, and understood in 3 seconds exactly what the offer meant. It wasn't generosity. A man didn't offer 50 times the purchase price of a distressed property unless he knew something about that property's value that the seller didn't. "Appreciate the offer," she said. "Shall we? But no thank you, Mr. Vane." He paused, recalibrated. "Winter will be harsh this year. The well's unreliable. The structures, I have a well plan, and the barn is already reinforced." She met his eyes. "Fences are nearly rebuilt, and I expect the northern pasture will be fully operational within the week. So, you see, the situation is a little more manageable than it might appear from the track." Something passed across Silas Vane's face, quick, controlled, but there. "You've had help," he said. "I've had a great deal of work." She closed her ledger. "Is there anything else I can help you with, Mr. Vane?" He looked at her for a moment, longer than was comfortable. "If you change your mind," he said, "the offer stands." He pulled a card from his coat pocket and leaned down to set it on the porch rail without dismounting. For now, he rode back up the track. Adeline picked up the card, looked at it, and set it precisely in the center of her ledger as a bookmark. Ronan appeared from around the barn corner. "How long were you there?" she asked. "Long enough." He was watching the track where Vane had gone. His voice was very quiet. "He offered you $50. "Yes." "And you said no." "Yes." He turned and looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, not quite relief, and not quite something else, something more complicated than a word she could easily put to it. "Why?" She looked up from the ledger. "Because if Silas Vane wants this property for $50, she said it's worth considerably more than $50. She held Ronan's gaze. "And I want to know why." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked away toward the eastern ridge, the way he sometimes did when he was thinking about something he wasn't sure he wanted to say. "There's something I should tell you," he said. "All right." He looked back at her. "Vane," he said, "is the man who arranged the loan that took this ranch." The afternoon light came flat and cold across the porch between them. Adeline set her ledger down carefully on the rail. "You'd better tell me everything," she said. And she noticed, somewhere in the back of her mind, that her hands had gone very still. Ronan didn't sit down to tell it. He stood at the edge of the porch, one hand braced on the rail, and he talked the way men talk when they've held something too long, and the weight of it has changed shape on them, not a clean pour, but a slow and reluctant one, like draining water from something that doesn't want to drain. He'd gone to Vane's land office in Harwick 2 years before the foreclosure. Not to Vane directly, Vane didn't sit behind a desk where ordinary ranchers could walk in and find him. He went to Greer, Vane's loan manager, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were already behind on something. The loan was $40 at 8% annual interest, 2-year term. It was high. Ronan knew it was high, but the drought had taken his second cattle herd in 3 years, and he needed the capital to purchase feedstock and repair the eastern fence line, or he wasn't going to have a ranch to worry about regardless. He'd made every payment, 12 of them on schedule, receipts collected each time, because his father had taught him that a man's word was his bond, but a piece of paper was his proof. The 14-month mark, he'd gone in to get a reconciliation, a standard accounting of what he owed versus what he'd paid, something any reasonable lender provided on request. Greer had taken 20 minutes to produce a ledger and then slid it across the desk like he was doing Ronan a favor. The number at the bottom was wrong by 40%. I showed him the receipts, Ronan said. His voice was even, but Adeline was close enough to see the muscle in his forearm flex against the porch rail. Every single one. Laid them out right there on his desk. He looked at them and he said, "Mr. Hale, the official ledger reflects the authorized interest recalculation and the late payment penalties as assessed by our office." Just like that. Official, authorized, assessed, like those words made it real. "And the 3 payments he said you'd missed," Adeline said. 4, 7, and 10. He looked at her. I had receipts for all 3. Signed by Greer himself. What did he say when you showed him his own signature? He said signatures weren't sufficient documentation without the corresponding entry in the main ledger. Ronan's jaw tightened. Which, conveniently, didn't have those entries. Adeline was quiet, turning this over. She'd spent 7 years keeping books for the Harwick Cooperative. She knew what a ledger manipulation looked like from the outside, the places where numbers didn't add, where entries appeared out of chronological sequence, where the handwriting changed slightly between pages that should have been written the same week. She knew because she'd once found it in a supplier account at the cooperative, minor, almost accidental, and she'd flagged it to the director, and they'd corrected it. She'd never considered what it looked like when someone did it on purpose. "Did you get anyone to look at the ledger?" she asked. "A judge? An attorney?" I tried. He said it with the exhaustion of a man who had long since finished being surprised by how that sentence ended. Harwick's circuit judge was Crawford at the time. Crawford and Vane had been partners in a mining claim since the early 80s. The territorial attorney's office in Cheyenne sent me a letter saying the matter was under review and I'd be notified of any findings. He paused. I never heard from them again. So the foreclosure went through. Took 4 months once the process started. They sold the cattle first at well below market to a buyer I later found out had connections to Vane's operation. Then the equipment, then the property. For $1, Adeline said. He looked at her directly. For $1. The late afternoon had gone gray and heavy around them, the kind of gray that sits on top of everything and makes the world feel smaller and more immediate. Adeline picked up his business card from where she'd put it in her ledger and held it between 2 fingers. "He didn't come here to make a generous offer," she said. "No, he came because he wanted to know who bought the property and how much I knew." She set the card back down. "And now he knows I said no, which means he knows I'm not going anywhere easily. That's going to cause problems. It might." She looked at him. "What else? You said there was something you should tell me." He looked away again, that East Ridge look. The habit she'd begun to read as him deciding how much truth to volunteer. "There's water on this property," he said. "Not just the well." She waited. "My grandfather found it. Dug a survey himself, which was unusual for the time, but he was a particular man and he wanted to know what he owned." Ronan turned from the rail and sat down on the porch step, elbows on his knees. "There's an underground spring running beneath the eastern ridge. Not accessible at the surface. It's too deep for a standard well, but it's there." He had it recorded in the Territorial Survey Ledger in Cheyenne in 1849, and it would still be on record, should be, unless someone went to the trouble of having it removed. He paused. "Survey records are territorial property. You'd need a clerk willing to take a significant risk." Adeline was quiet for a moment, thinking carefully about the arithmetic of what he'd just told her. A property with a reliable underground spring in a valley where drought conditions were erratic, and worsening that property wasn't worth $1. It wasn't worth 50. In terms of water rights in a cattle corridor, it could be worth enough to make a man like Silas Vane send his loan manager after struggling ranchers with a manipulated ledger and patience for a long game. He's been acquiring the neighboring properties, she said. It wasn't a question, but it came out like one, because the shape of it was still assembling itself in her mind. Dalton's ranch to the north sold 18 months ago. Peterson's place east of the ridge went to a landholding company I later found out Vane controls. The Marsh family gave up their water access claim during a legal dispute and moved to Colorado. He looked at his hands. I didn't understand what I was looking at until it was too late. I thought they were separate troubles, separate bad luck. They weren't. No. Adeline stood up from her chair and walked to the far end of the porch, thinking. The wind was picking up from the north now, and it had that particular bite to it that meant the temperature was going to drop hard after dark. She could see the steers in the north pasture moving toward the shelter end, which meant they felt it too. If the spring exists and it's still in the survey record, she said, and this property still holds legal access to it, then it belongs to Cinder Ridge, which means it belongs to me. Yes, she turned around. Can we find the survey ledger? That's the harder part, Ronan said. My grandfather kept a copy, I know he did, because I saw it when I was young. He kept it in a tin box in the storage room, along with the original land patent. He stopped. When the property was foreclosed, the personal contents were supposed to be held for 30 days before disposal. I went back on day 23, and the storage room had already been cleared. Adeline went very still. Someone removed the survey copy before the 30 days were up. Couldn't prove who, I just knew it was gone. He met her eyes. But the original is still in Cheyenne. Has to be, assuming the territorial record is intact. Then that's where we need to look. She came back to the center of the porch. I have contacts at the Cheyenne land office from my bookkeeping years. Not friends, exactly, but people who know my name and know I'm competent. She paused, working through it. Time. And in the meantime, Vane knows I refused his offer, and he's not a man who sits idle. No, Ronan agreed. He isn't. The next morning, she wrote a letter to a woman named Frances Alcott, who had worked as senior clerk at the Cheyenne Territorial Office for 11 years, and who had once thanked Adeline for catching an arithmetic error in a supply contract that would have cost the office considerable embarrassment. It was a thin thread of connection, but it was the kind of thread that held better than thicker ones, because it was based on something specific and real. She wrote the letter carefully, keeping it factual and precise. A property survey recorded in 1849 by a Ronan Hale, pertaining to underground water access rights on a parcel now recorded as Cinder Ridge in the Harwick area, Wyoming territory. She asked whether the record was intact and, if so, whether a certified copy could be obtained for a modest administrative fee. She did not mention Vane's name. She did not explain why she wanted it. She sent it with the Thursday Post rider. In the meantime, there was still a ranch to keep alive. The well project started that week and was harder and messier than either of them had anticipated. The problem wasn't just the cracked lining. Once Ronan had the top 8 feet out and was working by lamplight in the shaft, he found a second fracture lower down that had allowed contamination to pool. Fixing it properly meant 2 extra days in a hole in the frozen ground with inadequate lighting and mortar that wanted to set faster than he could work in the cold. Adeline worked the surface mixing mortar, lowering materials on a rope, holding the lamp at angles he directed, and learning by necessity the specific vocabulary of a man who'd been doing physical work his whole life and had no patience for imprecise instructions. When he said more slack, he meant 4 inches, not 8. When he said hold it, he meant absolutely still, and he was not interested in conversation while she was doing it. On the second day in the shaft, he came up for the midday break with his hands scraped and his voice short from breathing close air. And she had coffee and a pan of cornbread waiting, and he ate half of it without speaking. And she let him because she was learning when to wait. The lower fracture is worse than I thought, he said finally. Can you fix it? I'm fixing it. I said it was worse, not impossible. All right. She refilled his cup. How long? 1 more day if the mortar sets right tonight. 2 if it doesn't. He rubbed his face. I used to do this in summer like it was nothing. You used to do it when you weren't also cold and running on $6 of future earnings. He looked at her. There was something briefly surprised in it, like he'd expected something different and didn't know what to do with what he'd gotten. Fair, he said. I know. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite there, but it visited. That evening, While Ronan worked on the lower shaft by lamplight, Adeline found the old survey ledger. She hadn't been looking for it specifically. She'd been going through the storage room, which she'd been slowly sorting since she arrived. One box at a time after the day's work was done, looking for any tools or materials she could use, because every dollar she didn't spend on new supplies was a dollar that went toward keeping the ranch operational through spring. The ledger was at the bottom of a box she'd pulled from, behind a collapsed shelf unit, underneath 2 broken leather straps, and what appeared to be the rusted remains of a hand cultivator. It was small, not quite the size she'd expected for a ranch survey document, and the cover was stiff from cold and age. Someone had written Property Survey and Account C. Ridgy on the inside front cover in a clear, deliberate hand. She carried it to the lamp and opened it. It wasn't a complete survey, it was a working copy, a rancher's own record, the kind of document someone kept for themselves rather than for official submission. But it was meticulous. Page after page of measurements, notations, water source markings, acreage calculations. And there, on page 23, in handwriting that was slightly different from the pages around it, slightly more careful, like someone writing down something they wanted, remembered a notation in ink that had turned brown at the edges but was still entirely legible. Eastern Ridge Lower Formation. Underground water source confirmed by bore. Depth 47 feet. Spring-fed. Continuous flow. Legal access retained by property deed. Recorded Territorial Office, Cheyenne. August 1849. Not to be sold or transferred separately. Adeline read it 3 times. She read it a 4th time, more slowly. Then she walked out to the yard, crossed to the well, and called down into the dark. Ronan. A pause. His voice came up hollow from the shaft. What? I need you up here. I'm in the middle of a seam. Finish the seam and come up. I found something. She heard him working for another 4 minutes. Then the rope moved and he came up hand over hand, slower than he'd gone down, because the cold had been in the shaft with him all day and his arms knew it. He swung his leg over the edge and stood up, and she held the ledger toward him without preamble. He took it, looked at the cover. Something happened in his face that she couldn't immediately name recognition, but also something underneath that, something older. That's my grandfather's handwriting, he said. Page 23. He found it. She watched him read. His face went very still. This was, he said, in the storage room, in a box behind the collapsed shelf. I don't think they found it when they cleared the room. She paused. Or they looked and didn't know what they were looking at. He looked at the notation again. Underground spring. 47 feet. Continuous flow, she said. That's the word that matters. Not seasonal, not drought-dependent. Continuous. He lowered the ledger slowly. Adeline. He almost never used her name. It landed with a different weight when he did. I know, if this is intact in Cheyenne. It will be, she said. Survey records are territorial. He couldn't touch them without going through the office, and he'd need a clerk willing to falsify a territorial document. That's a different risk than manipulating a private loan ledger. Ronan was quiet, holding the old ledger with both hands like it might decide to be somewhere else. He bought every ranch around this property, he said. Dalton, Peterson, the marshes. His voice had gone quieter. He didn't just want the land. He wants the water corridor, she said. If he controls all the surrounding property and then develops the spring controls who has access and at what price during drought years, he controls the valley's cattle economy. She looked at the Eastern Ridge in the dark. That's not just money, that's power over every rancher in this part of Wyoming for the next 20 years. The night was fully down now, and the temperature with it. Somewhere in the north pasture, one of the steers called once and went quiet. He knows you turned him down, Ronan said. Yes. He won't just leave. No, he won't. She took the ledger back carefully. So we need to move faster than he does. The following week tested both of them in ways that weren't convenient or instructive. They were simply hard. The way that period just before winter fully commits is always hard on the high Wyoming plateau. When the cold is serious, but the snow hasn't arrived yet to make it navigable, and instead everything is frozen mud and short light and wind that has made a personal decision about getting inside every structure it encounters. The well was finished and the water ran clean. Ronan tested it 3 times over 2 days before he declared it sound, which she appreciated, because she'd seen men declare things sound, because they were tired of worrying about them, and he wasn't that kind of man. They started on the second phase of the north fence, which required digging post holes in ground that was trying hard to become permanently solid. And Adeline spent 4 days learning that a post hole digger was a tool with opinions about every piece of ground it met, and those opinions were rarely positive. Her hands, which had softened somewhat in her school mistress years, hardened back faster than she expected. The blisters came and went. The calluses stayed. Ronan watched her work without comment. She noticed he never offered to do her portion. He waited to be asked, and when she asked directly, he showed her, rather than doing it for her, which was its own form of respect that she hadn't gotten from most men in her life, and which she recognized clearly even if she didn't say so. On the 19th day, she discovered she wasn't the only one keeping records. She'd gone to the storage room for a spare coil of wire and found, on the small shelf near the brazier, a folded piece of paper with writing she recognized as Ronan's, the same precise, slightly cramped hand he'd used to label the fence post measurements she'd asked him to write down. She wouldn't have looked except the edge of it had caught under the coil, and she'd had to pull it free, and when she set it on the shelf beside the coil, she saw the numbers on the outside. Not account numbers, dates. She didn't unfold it, but she stood there for a moment longer than she needed to. At supper that evening, they had begun eating at the same table, by his unspoken agreement. Around day 12, the three-legged table having been replaced by the discovery of a sound four-legged one in the storage room's back section, she said, "Without setup, you're keeping a record of the payments." He didn't look up from his plate. "What?" "The paper on the shelf. It's dated. You're writing down the work you're doing and when." Pause. "Is that a problem?" he said. "No, it's smart." She turned her fork over. "You want documentation in case there's ever a dispute." He set his fork down. "When I lost this ranch," he said carefully, "it was because the only record that mattered was the one I didn't control." He looked at her directly. "I told myself I'd never be in that position again." Regardless of the situation, she held his gaze. "Regardless of who owns the property." "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Good, keep doing it." She picked up her fork. "And if you want, I'll countersign each entry. 2 records are harder to argue with than 1. Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise. More like the careful recalibration of a man who keeps finding that the ground is slightly different from what he expected. "All right," he said. "Give me the paper after supper." He did. She countersigned each dated entry and handed it back without reading the content, which she could see he noticed and which she intended. The letter from Francis Alcott arrived on a Thursday 16 days after Adeline had sent her request. She opened it at the porch table while Ronan was in the north pasture, and she read it twice before she trusted what she was seeing. Francis had located the survey record, the original, filed August 1849, Marshall Hale, Cinder Ridge Parcel, Wyoming Territory. It was intact, all pages present. The water access notation was on record exactly as described. Francis was including a certified copy with the letter, for which she was charging a standard administrative fee of $1.50, and she hoped Adeline was well and doing something that merited the trouble she'd clearly gone to. The certified copy was there, folded behind the letter, stamped and signed in 2 places by the Territorial Records Office. Adeline held it for a long time. Then she put it inside the old survey ledger, in between pages, so it would lay flat. And she carried the whole thing back to the storage room and wrapped it in oilcloth and put it in the bottom of her trunk, under the records box, in the back corner, where anyone going through her belongings in a hurry would find 20 other things before they found that. She was sitting on the porch with ordinary mending in her hands, a seam on Ronan's work coat that had split 2 days earlier and which she'd been meaning to address since then when he came back from the pasture and saw her face. He stopped in the yard. "What happened?" "The spring is real," she said. "It's in the Territorial Record. I have a certified copy." He didn't move for a moment. "Francis Alcott," Adeline continued. She came through. She set down the coat. "Silas Vane has been building toward controlling this valley's water access for at least 3 years that I can trace. He bought out or broke the surrounding properties. He needed this one to complete the corridor." She met Ronan's eyes. "He arranged your loan knowing the drought would create pressure, and then he had the payments erased because he couldn't afford to wait for you to default naturally. He needed the property before someone else found the spring." Ronan walked to the porch and sat on the step. The silence had a different quality to it than any silence they'd shared before. It was the silence of two people looking at the same map and finally understanding the full territory. If we go to the territorial court with this, he said, with the ledger copy and the payment receipts and the survey record, it's fraud. Documented fraud. Yes, he'll know we're moving against him the moment we file anything. Yes, she said again, which is why we don't file yet. We wait until we have everything organized and witnessed, and then we move fast. Ronan looked at her. You've done this before, he said. It wasn't quite an accusation, and it wasn't quite a compliment. I've kept books for institutions that had reason to hide things, she said. I know what makes a case solid. You need primary documents, receipts, original records, not copies of copies. You need witnesses who saw transactions happen, and you need to present it all at once, so there isn't time to prepare a counter-narrative. Quiet, working through it. My receipts, he said. Original payment receipts, signed by Greer. Those are primary documents. The survey ledger, from the storage room, my grandfather's working copy. Corroborating evidence. Not sufficient on its own, but strong alongside the certified territorial copy. And the altered ledger that Greer showed me. He paused. I never had access to it. No, she said. But we might be able to get someone to request it officially. Territorial judge with subpoena authority could compel the ledger's production. She folded her hands on the mending. Question is whether we can get a judge who isn't in Vane's pocket. Ronan made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. In Harwick, that's a short list. Then we go over Harwick. She looked at him. The territorial circuit judge for the Northern District is a man named Alderman. He rides out of Buffalo, not Harwick. He has no recorded connection to Vane's land interests. She paused. I looked him up before I bought this property. I look up local governance in any area before I commit significant resources. Ronan stared at her. You researched the judges before you moved here. I researched the property history, the local authority structure, and the water availability in the region. She picked up the mending again. I'm a bookkeeper. I don't go into things without knowing the numbers. You didn't know about the spring. I knew the property had sold for $1, which meant either no one had done the due diligence or they had and were hiding something. Either way, it was interesting. She turned the coat seam toward the light to check her stitching. I was prepared for it to be nothing. I wasn't prepared for it to be this. But the principal held. He was quiet for a long time. You're going to fight him, he said finally. We're going to fight him, she said. Your receipts and my ledger and Francis Alcott's certified copy and a territorial judge who doesn't owe Vane anything. She looked up from the mending. He built this scheme assuming the people he hurt wouldn't have the resources or the documentation to counter it. He was right about most of them. She held Ronan's gaze. He was wrong about you because you kept your receipts. And he was wrong about me because I keep everything. Ronan looked out at the ranch, the repaired fence line, the well with its new cover set level and sound, the barn with its reinforced north wall, the north pasture where 4 steers grazed in the gray afternoon, alive and contained and watered. He's going to push back, he said, hard, before we can get to Alderman. I know. He has money, and he has people willing to do what money asks. I know that too. He turned and looked at her fully, the way he'd looked at her that first night in the barn, trying to work out what she actually was, behind the thing she appeared to be. Are you scared? He asked. She considered the question honestly, the way she'd taught her students to consider arithmetic, not with the answer you wanted, but with the answer the numbers gave you. Yes, she said, but I bought a ranch for $1 in November with everything I had, and I didn't leave. She met his eyes. Fear doesn't seem to be the thing that stops me. He was quiet for another moment. Then he stood up from the step, picked up his coat, and went to start the evening feeding. He was halfway across the yard when she heard him say, without turning around quietly enough that the wind nearly took it, "It doesn't seem to stop you at all." She kept her eyes on the mending, but she was smiling at it for a long time after he was gone. 21st day arrived with a sky the color of a bruise. Adeline had learned to read Wyoming weather the way she'd learned to read ledger columns, not by instinct, which she didn't have yet, but by watching what Ronan watched and tracking what he tracked. When he stepped out of the barn that morning and looked north for longer than usual, she set down her coffee and looked north too. Cloud formation sitting on the horizon was not moving the way morning clouds moved. It was sitting low and committed, the kind of system that had made up its mind about where it was going and how long it planned to stay. How long do we have, she asked, before it hits? Maybe 2 days. Maybe 1.5. He didn't take his eyes off the horizon. It's going to be the first real one of the season. How bad? Bad enough. He turned back toward the yard. We need to get the hay in from the east stack before it's buried. And I want to check the barn roof again. The section over the south stall wasn't sitting right after the last rain. She was already calculating. I can manage the hay if you do the roof. The east stack's heavy. You'll need the cart. Then I'll use the cart. He looked at her in that sideways way he had when he was deciding whether to argue. The cartwheel's been pulling right, he said. Keep your weight to the left side when you load it, or it'll want to tip. All right? And don't stack higher than your shoulder, or you won't be able to see where you're going. Ronan, what? I understand the hay cart. He made a sound that wasn't agreement, but wasn't argument either, and went to get his tools. She spent the morning running hay with the cart, 5 trips from the east stack to the barn, which was 4 more trips than she'd anticipated because she'd underestimated how much volume settled into less weight than expected when it was dry. Cartwheel pulled right, exactly as he'd said. She compensated by loading heavier on the left and keeping the speed slow, and she only lost a portion of the load once. On the 3rd trip, when the front wheel found a rut she hadn't seen, and the cart lurched sideways and deposited roughly 1/3 of its load on the frozen ground, she stacked it back up without stopping to resent the situation and kept moving. By noon, the east stack was in. Ronan came down from the roof with a new problem. 2 boards need replacing in the south section, he said. Not today's problem, they'll hold through the storm, but after the thaw I want to address the whole south face. I'll put it in the ledger. Also, the east gutter's pulling away from the fascia. I can reattach it, but the bracket that holds it is cracked. It'll need a replacement bracket before spring, or we'll have water running behind the siding. She was writing. Anything else? He sat down on the porch step and pulled off one work glove and pressed his fingers against a spot on his right hand that she noticed had been bothering him for 3 days. She'd said nothing because he hadn't said anything, and she was getting better at knowing when saying nothing was the correct response. Your hand, she said. What is it? Nothing, Ronan. Tendon. From pulling wire in the cold, it'll ease up. Let me see it. Adeline, I'm not going to fix it. I just want to see how bad it is. He looked at her for a moment with the expression he used when he was calculating the energy cost of resistance against the energy cost of compliance. He held out his hand. The swelling was visible along the back of his palm, running toward the wrist. Not dramatic, but present, and the skin around it had that tight, faintly shiny quality that meant it had been like this for more than a day. You've been working on this for 3 days, she said. It's not debilitating. It's also not nothing. She released his hand. Tonight you're going to soak it, and I'm going to wrap it. And tomorrow you're going to tell me before you do any task that puts significant pull on it. He pulled his glove back on. You sound like a schoolmistress, he said. I was a schoolmistress. Now I'm a property owner who needs her only capable worker functional through winter. She picked up her ledger. So let's not be stubborn about the hand. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. That night, she wrapped his hand with a strip of clean linen she kept in her provisions trunk, and he sat at the table and let her without making it difficult, which told her the tendon hurt more than he'd admitted. She used a tension wrap she'd learned from a physician's wife in Cheyenne, who'd taught her 3 useful things during a 3-year acquaintance: how to manage a minor sprain, how to write a proper letter of complaint, and how to make coffee that didn't taste like disappointment. Does that feel better or worse? She asked when she'd tied the end. He flexed his fingers carefully. Better, good. She put away the linen. Where'd you learn to do that? A doctor's wife. She sat back down at her side of the table and opened her ledger. She was practical in the ways that mattered. He looked at his wrapped hand. Outside, the wind had picked up considerably, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since sundown, and the sound the barn made under it was no longer the easy groaning of earlier weeks, but something more urgent, like a structure having a serious conversation with itself about its choices. The ledger, Ronan said. The one Greer showed me, the manipulated one. He was working through something she could see him working through. Even if a judge subpoenas it, Vane's people will have time to adjust it. Or lose it. I've been thinking about that, she said, without looking up from her own writing. And the payments, you made 12 of them, each one receipted and signed by Greer. She set her pen down. Greer signed those receipts in his capacity as Vane's authorized loan agent. That means legally Vane's office acknowledged each payment at the time it was made. They'll say the receipts were issued in error. They'll try. But here's the thing about ledger fraud. It's not enough to change the numbers. You have to change all the numbers and account for everything that doesn't match. She tapped her pen against the table. The amounts on your receipts will correspond to specific dates. On those same dates, there should be corresponding deposits in whatever account Vane's lending operation used. If those deposits appear in the financial records, and they likely do, because whoever manipulated the repayment ledger wasn't necessarily thinking about the deposit ledger, then we have a discrepancy that speaks for itself. Ronan looked at her. You're saying the money's in his own account. He took the payments, credited them somewhere else, and then erased them from your file. That's what the numbers suggest. I can't prove it without seeing the accounts. But a territorial judge with subpoena authority can compel both ledgers, the loan ledger and the operating account, and a bookkeeper worth anything can show the discrepancy inside 20 minutes. She paused. I'm a bookkeeper worth quite a lot, actually. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, he's going to realize what you're doing. He already suspects something. Turning down $50 wasn't invisible. She closed the ledger. Question is whether he moves first or we do. They found out the answer 2 days later when the storm hit and the spring went dry. It happened overnight. Adeline discovered it in the morning when she went to check the lower trough and found it sitting still and silent, not draining, not flowing, simply not receiving. She stood there for a moment, then walked to the channel they'd dug to test the eastern ridge flow. The preliminary work they'd done after finding the ledger survey entry, and the channel was empty. She went back inside. Ronan, he was awake. He'd been awake before her. She could tell by the coffee and the way the stove had been burning for at least an hour. The spring stopped. He was already pulling on his coat. They went out together into the storm's edge it had hit the evening before. Not the full force yet, but the leading system, hard wind and dropping temperature, and a sleet that was trying to decide whether to be snow. Ronan went up the eastern ridge access path, while Adeline managed the livestock troughs, filling them from the main well while the well's capacity held, calculating how long it would last against current herd needs, and not letting herself think too hard about the answer. Ronan came back 40 minutes later, and the look on his face told her everything before he opened his mouth. It's blocked, he said, upstream. Someone piled rock and dirt across the upper channel mouth, not a natural collapse. The edges are too clean and the material's been moved, not fallen. Adeline stood very still. When, last night or the night before? Under cover of the storm coming in, he pulled off his outer glove and pressed his wrapped hand against his side for warmth. It's a 3-person job to clear it, minimum. The frozen ground up there is we can't do it alone. She looked at the main well, looked at the sky. The livestock can't go without water through a full storm system, she said. No, 2 days without in this cold and we start losing them. And the storm's at least days, maybe 3. She turned and looked east, toward the ridge. She couldn't see clearly through the sleet. This was the play, she understood. This was Vane's answer to her refusal. Not a direct confrontation, he was too careful for that, too practiced in the indirect method. He'd sent someone up the ridge in the dark to block the channel and let Wyoming's weather do the rest. If the livestock died, the financial loss would be severe. If she ran out of water entirely, she'd have to make choices about what to save and what to sacrifice. And if she sold the ranch in desperation, he'd have his answer after all. Or, she thought, and this was the thought that arrived cold and clear alongside the sleet, or he was counting on her not knowing anyone in this valley. Not having built anything here yet, being alone with one man who'd been beaten before and might flinch when pushed hard enough. She turned back to Ronan. Who else did he ruin? She said. He looked at her. The neighboring ranchers, Dalton, Peterson, the Marshes. She held his gaze. Are any of them still in the area? Dalton sold and left. Peterson, he stopped, thought. Peterson's running a small operation east of the creek now. Quarter the size of what he had, his son stayed with him. He paused. The Marsh family, the older son, Will Marsh, he stayed in the county. He's working a leased spread about 4 miles north. And they all lost property or water rights because of Vane. Yes, then they have an interest in seeing him stopped. I can't ask those men to... You're not asking them anything. She was already moving toward the house. I am, and I'm not asking a favor. I'm asking whether they want to help clear a blocked channel that was deliberately sabotaged by the same man who took their ranches, in exchange for being witnesses to that sabotage when we bring it to Judge Alderman. He followed her inside. They don't know you, he said. They know me, And they know I lost Cinder Ridge, which doesn't exactly make my credibility. You kept your receipts. She was pulling on her heavier coat. That's your credibility. She turned around. Ronan. He counted on you being isolated. He counted on me being a stranger. He did not count on us being two kinds of thorough at the same time. He stared at her. Then he went to get his horse. He rode out while the sleet was thickening toward something worse. And she stayed and managed the troughs and the livestock and the wood stove and the ongoing calculation of water reserves with a kind of focused practicality that she was starting to recognize in herself, the ability to feel the fear fully and work. Anyway, not because the fear went away, but because there were things that needed doing, and she was the person there to do them. 3 hours later, Ronan came back. He came back with 2 men. Ed Peterson was in his 60s, barrel-chested and wind-weathered, with a face that had been set in wariness so long it had become its resting shape. His son, a younger man of maybe 25 named Cal, had his father's build and an expression that mixed anger with something that hadn't quite given up yet. Will Marsh was 30, lean, with a scar along his jaw and the kind of eyes that had seen something they hadn't finished processing. They stood in her yard, all 3 of them, in the sleet, and looked at her. She looked back. "Thank you for coming," she said. Ed Peterson said, "Ronan says Vane blocked your spring channel. Deliberately. Upstream. The rock placement is deliberate, not a natural collapse. You can prove that? I can show you, and then you can decide what you think." She met his eyes steadily. "But I'll be honest with you, Mr. Peterson. I'm not just asking you to help clear the channel. I'm asking you to be witnesses. When this goes to a territorial judge, and I want men who stood on that ridge and saw what was done with their own eyes." Ed Peterson looked at Ronan. Ronan said nothing. He was watching Peterson the way you watch someone come to a decision they have to make themselves. "My father built that ranch," Peterson said. It wasn't a complete sentence, but it was a complete thought. "I know," Adeline said. "Vane took it through a loan manipulation. Same kind of thing Ronan went through. I couldn't prove it at the time. You might be able to now." She looked at all 3 of them. "Whatever the documentation, you kept payment records, correspondence. Anything, bring it to me, and I'll tell you whether it builds a case. I've spent 7 years reading financial records for an institution. I know what fraud looks like from the inside." Will Marsh said, "You're talking about taking Silas Vane to a territorial court." "Yes. He has friends on the bench in Harwick." "We're not going to Harwick. We're going to Judge Alderman in Buffalo." Marsh looked at Peterson. Something passed between them, a rapid, silent negotiation of the kind that happens between people who've been through something together. "I have my father's payment ledger," Marsh said. "All of it. He kept it like a holy book." "I want to see it," Adeline said. After the channel, they went up the ridge together, all 5 of them, in the worsening storm. The channel blockage was exactly what Ronan had described, deliberate and recent, a consolidated pile of rock and packed earth across the upper mouth, that no natural process had assembled in that configuration. The edges where the material met the existing channel were clean. The soil on the top of the pile was disturbed, but not weathered. Someone had done this in the last 48 hours. Will Marsh crouched beside it and looked at the material carefully. "This rock's not from the ridge," he said. "Look at the composition. This is creek bottom stone. Someone carried it up here." "How far's the nearest creek?" Adeline asked. "Quarter-mile south," Cal Peterson said. "Maybe less. Someone made multiple trips," Ronan said. He was standing back, looking at the blockage from a wider angle. "In the dark, in the early storm, that's deliberate and it's planned, not impulsive." "Agreed," Adeline said. She looked at Ed Peterson. "Agreed?" Ed Peterson looked at the pile, at the clean edges, at the creek-bottom stone stacked where ridge stone should have been. "Agreed," he said. They broke through it in an hour and 40 minutes of hard, cold, miserable work prying stone with an iron bar Ronan had brought, moving material by hand because there was no space for a cart at that angle on the ridge, passing pieces down a human chain with Cal Peterson at the bottom end, throwing things clear of the channel. The wind was full force by the time they got the main blockage clear, and the water started moving again, sluggish at first, reluctant, then steadier as the pressure built from behind. Adeline felt it before she heard it, a faint vibration in the earth under her boots, the underground system beginning to reassert itself. Then the flow came through. Cal Peterson, standing at the base with his hands and coat thoroughly soaked with ice-cold mud, made a sound that was not quite a shout and not quite a laugh. His father said nothing, but put a hand briefly on the younger man's shoulder. Will Marsh looked at Adeline. "Now what?" he said. She pushed a strand of wet hair away from her face with the back of her wrist. "Now we go back to my house," she said, "and you tell me everything you kept." They sat around her table, all 5 of them, barely fitting for the better part of 3 hours that evening, while the full storm hit the ridge and the house moved in the wind in that unsettling but not yet alarming way of structures that have been built to flex rather than resist. Adeline kept the stove going and the coffee coming and said almost nothing while Ed Peterson and Will Marsh talked. She listened the way she had always listened to numbers completely, without editorializing, letting the pattern emerge from the information rather than imposing one on it. What emerged was worse than she'd expected and more coherent than she'd hoped. Vane's operation worked on a consistent model: identify ranches with hidden value water access, mineral rights, or simply strategic position in the land corridor. Approach during periods of financial stress, usually drought years. Offer loans at rates that were high but not impossible. Then manipulate the payment records to create a default condition the rancher couldn't counter without access to Vane's own ledgers. Move through foreclosure quickly, before anyone could mount a legal challenge. Purchase the property through a landholding company that obscured his ownership, and then sit on it until conditions were right to develop or resell. He'd done this to at least 6 properties in the valley over 7 years. Ronan's ranch had been the last piece. Adeline sat back from the table when Peterson finished talking and looked at the papers, spread between them payment records, correspondence, a letter from Vane's office denying a debt dispute that was itself evidence of the dispute's existence. "I need copies of everything," she said. "Not originals. You keep those somewhere safe, not in your homes." She looked around the table. "These documents cannot all be in one place. If there's a fire." "I'm not giving him the satisfaction of being scared of a fire," Ed Peterson said. "This isn't about fear. This is about evidence management." She held his gaze. "If the originals are destroyed, there's nothing to present in court. I need copies I can take to Alderman, and you need to hold the originals somewhere he can be summoned to examine them." She paused. "Does anyone have family outside the valley?" Cal Peterson said his mother's people were in Laramie. Will Marsh had a sister in Buffalo. "Send the originals there," Adeline said, "before the end of the week, in separate packages, different days. Tell no one in Harwick." She looked at Ronan. "Your receipts." "My sister-in-law in Casper," he said. "Clara's sister. She'd keep them. Send them. Keep copies here." Adeline straightened the papers. "When we file with Alderman, I want to walk into that courthouse with documented fraud against 6 properties, a certified territorial survey showing deliberate water access manipulation, physical evidence of sabotage witnessed by 5 people, and a clear accounting trail showing payment discrepancies in Vane's own operating records." She looked around the table. He built this scheme assuming that the people he targeted wouldn't talk to each other, wouldn't compare records, and wouldn't have anyone capable of reading what those records actually said. The storm howled against the north wall. The lamp on the table moved in the draft and steadied. "When do we file?" Will Marsh asked. "Not yet. We need 2 more things. First, I need time to prepare a consolidated case document, one that presents all the evidence in sequence, clearly readable, so Alderman can understand the pattern without being walked through it." She paused. "Second, we need to know if there are any other ranchers in this situation we haven't reached yet. Because the more claims we can consolidate into one filing, the harder it is for Vane's attorneys to pick them apart individually." Ed Peterson said Harlan Briggs. "He lost his East acreage 18 months ago to a land dispute he couldn't finance a defense for. He's still on his west section. Can you reach him?" "He's not going to be easy. Briggs doesn't trust much anymore." "Tell him I'm a bookkeeper who's read his contract," Adeline said. "Help." After the men left late into the tail end of the storm, which had shifted to actual snow, heavy and serious, the house was very quiet. Adeline sat at the table with the copies she'd made of the Peterson and Marsh documents and her own consolidated notes, and she let herself be tired for approximately 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes, because she couldn't afford more than that. Then she picked up her pen and started organizing. Ronan was in the doorway from the porch, snow on his coat, checking that the door was properly set against the wind. "You should sleep," he said. "I will, Adeline." He said it quietly, but with weight. "It's past midnight. I know. An hour more and I'll have the Peterson payment sequenced." She didn't look up. The pattern in the dates is important. The payment erasures happen at specific intervals, and if I can show Alderman that the intervals are consistent across multiple cases, it supports the argument of systematic fraud rather than clerical error. He was quiet. Will Marsh's sister is in Buffalo, he said after a moment. If she's willing to receive the originals and coordinate with his clerk's office. I thought of that. Adeline did look up then. Would you trust her to do it right? But Will trusts her, and Will's judgment has been pretty sound. Then I'll write her a letter. Tonight, so it goes with the Tuesday post. Ronan moved to the stove and put on a small amount of wood, careful with it. She noticed, the way you are when you've learned to be careful with everything. He stood with his hands toward the warmth for a moment. He's going to know, he said, when we file, or maybe before if someone talks. I know, he's not going to wait politely for the court date. No, she set her pen down for a moment, but the court filing is a matter of public record once it's made. At that point, anything he does to obstruct or intimidate becomes additional evidence of his disposition toward the case. She looked at him. He's smart, Ronan. Smart enough to have run this scheme for 7 years without a successful legal challenge. He'll know that visible pressure becomes counterproductive the moment we've filed, unless he makes it look like an accident. She held his gaze without flinching. Yes, she said. That's why I said no one in Harwick knows what we're doing, and why the originals go out of the valley before we file, and why I'm keeping 3 copies of the case document in 3 separate locations, including ones sealed and addressed to the territorial governor's office that goes in the mail the same day we file with Alderman. Ronan stared at her, the governor. A sealed envelope addressed to the territorial governor, outlining the fraud case and citing the specific judge we've filed with, doesn't need to be opened as long as the case proceeds normally, she said. But it exists, and if something happens to me or to you or to the filing, it gets opened. He was very quiet. You thought of that before tonight, he said. I thought of it when Vane rode up the access track on his expensive horse. She picked up her pen again. He's used to dealing with people who are reacting. I prefer to plan. Outside, the storm had gentled slightly, still heavy, but the wind's worst had moved east. Somewhere in the north pasture, muffled by snow and distance, one of the steers moved. The underground spring was flowing again. The channel was clear. Ronan stood by the stove for a moment longer, his wrapped hand held loosely at his side. My grandfather used to say the ridge kept its own secrets, he said. Came out quietly, almost like he hadn't meant to say it aloud. He meant the spring. He found it himself, dug the bore himself, and he said the ridge just gave it up. Was waiting. Adeline kept writing, but she was listening. He said a place doesn't belong to you because you hold the deed. Ronan said. It belongs to you because you know it, because you know where the water is, and which fence line gives first in hard wind, and which corner of the north pasture floods in spring. He stopped. I thought I knew this land better than anyone alive. She looked up. You do, she said. He met her eyes. But knowing it wasn't enough to save it, he said. No, she held his gaze steadily. Knowing it and being able to document what you know, that's different. That's what he took from you, not the land. The record of what you knew. Something moved through his face that she didn't try to name. Get some sleep, she said more gently than usual. Tomorrow I need you to show me exactly where on the ridge the channel was blocked. I want to draw it. Precise measurements and compass bearings, so it can't be disputed. He nodded. He was in the doorway when she said, without looking up from her work, Ronan, you should know, regardless of how this ends with the court, what you built here. What your grandfather built and your father kept, and you ran for 23 years in drought and loss and difficulty. She paused. That's not in any ledger, but it's not nothing. He didn't answer. But he stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to before he went to the barn. She wrote until 2 in the morning. When she finally closed the ledger, the snow had gentled to something soft and steady, and Cinder Ridge was entirely white, except for the lamplight from the house window laying a long yellow rectangle across the yard. In the morning, they would measure the ridge. In the week after, she would write the case document. In the month after that, they would file. But for right now, spring was running, and the livestock were watered, and the evidence was building, and the envelope addressed to the territorial governor was already written and sealed and sitting in the bottom of her trunk next to the certified survey copy and the oilcloth-wrapped ledger. Silas Vane had built a scheme on the assumption that the people he targeted were alone. He'd been wrong about that from the moment Adeline Marlowe climbed down from Cobb's wagon in the mud and didn't look back. The snow held for 4 days. Adeline used every one of them. While the storm kept the world contracted to the distance between the house and the barn, she worked at the table with the lamp burning close and her ledger open and the accumulated documents of 5 ruined ranches spread across every surface that wasn't actively being used for eating or sleeping. She organized them chronologically first, then by type payment records separate from correspondence, separate from loan agreements. And then she began the cross-referencing that she'd known from the start was where the real case lived. The pattern that emerged was not subtle once you knew how to look at it. Vane's operation had a rhythm. Loans were issued during drought stress years, always through Greer's office, always at rates that were high enough to generate significant interest income, but not so high as to trigger immediate territorial usury scrutiny. Payments were accepted for 12 to 14 months, long enough to establish a pattern, long enough that the borrower felt the loan was manageable. Then, in a window between months 14 and 18, the payment record was adjusted. Not all at once. 2 or 3 payments removed, interest recalculated upward, penalties added for the manufactured defaults. The borrower would discover the discrepancy when they came in for a routine reconciliation or when they received a default notice. By then, the gap between what the ledger showed and what the receipts showed was large enough to be catastrophic, and the time required to mount a legal challenge was longer than the foreclosure process that was already moving. It was elegant, in the cold way that well-engineered fraud is always elegant. The mechanism had very few moving parts. It required only Greer's cooperation, a ledger that stayed inside Vane's office, and a legal environment too slow or too compromised to respond in time. What Vane had not accounted for was a woman who had spent 7 years reading other people's financial records for a living, and who understood, in her bones, that every manipulation left a secondary trace if you knew where the trace would appear. The deposit ledger. Every payment the ranchers had made, every payment that Greer had signed a receipt for, and then erased from the loan record, those funds had gone somewhere. Money didn't vanish, it moved. And wherever Vane's operating account received deposits, there would be entries that corresponded. In amount and date, to payments his loan ledger claimed were never made. She couldn't access Vane's operating accounts directly. But a territorial judge with subpoena authority could compel their production, and when those accounts were placed side by side with the receipts, the alignment would be either perfectly explicable or completely damning. She was fairly certain which it would be. On the 3rd snow day, she wrote the case document. It took 11 hours, and she filled 22 pages in her careful schoolmistress, hand the writing she defaulted to when precision mattered more than speed. She organized it the way she'd been taught to organize a financial audit report. Summary statement, evidentiary inventory, chronological narrative of the fraud mechanism, individual case documentation for each affected property, and a consolidated analysis showing the pattern across all 6 ranches. She wrote it in language a judge could read without a bookkeeper's translation, clear, factual, each claim sourced to a specific document in the evidentiary inventory. No rhetoric, no appeals to sympathy, just numbers and dates and the places where they didn't match. When she finished, she read it through once, corrected 4 arithmetic references she'd copied incorrectly from the source documents, and then sat back and felt the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical work, but from sustained high-stakes concentration. Ronan had been in and out during the day, managing the livestock in the barn and the ongoing minor crises of a working ranch in deep winter, and he'd left her alone to work with a discipline that she'd come to appreciate. He understood what she was doing, and he understood that interruptions had a cost, and so he'd fed her at regular intervals, setting a plate near her without comment and removing it when it was empty and otherwise stayed out of her way. That evening, he sat across the table from her, and she pushed the case document toward him. "Read it," she said. He picked it up and read without speaking, turning pages slowly. She drank her coffee and watched the lamp and didn't watch him. When he finished, he set it down and was quiet for a moment. "It's all there," he said. "Yes, the deposit ledger angle, that's the part he can't answer. Even if he produces a corrected loan ledger, the deposit records will show what came in and when." "That's the load-bearing section," she agreed. "Everything else builds context." He looked at the document on the table between them. "When do we send it?" Another week. I want Harlan Briggs's records included if Ed Peterson can reach him. She pulled the document back and set it in its oilcloth wrapper. And I want to time the filing so that Alderman receives it when he's sitting in Buffalo, not when he's on circuit. I want him at his desk with his clerk available and time to read it properly before anyone can get to him with a counter-narrative. Ronan said nothing. He was looking at his hands, the wrapped one healing now, the swelling down, the fingers moving more freely when he flexed them. After we file, he said, how long before a hearing? I don't know Alderman's calendar. Maybe 4 weeks. Maybe 6. She looked at him. It will feel like a long time. What does Vane do in 4 to 6 weeks? He finds out we've filed probably within a day, because court filings are public record in territorial jurisdiction, and then he has to decide how to respond. She folded her hands on the table. His attorneys will file motions to dismiss, challenge document authenticity, question jurisdiction. Standard procedure. It buys time, and it raises costs for the opposing party. Which is us. Which is us. I have $63 remaining in operating funds after the winter expenses. She said it plainly, the way she handled all uncomfortable numbers. Legal representation at the hearing level would run $30 to $40 for even modest counsel, which means we either find someone willing to take the case on contingency payment from any judgment awarded, or we present without counsel and rely on the document quality. Ronan looked at her. The document quality, he said. The document quality is very good, she said, and territorial hearings in fraud cases of this scope are administrative proceedings, not full trials. Judge Alderman will be evaluating evidence, not listening to argument. A well-prepared evidentiary package can speak for itself if it's organized correctly. You sound certain. I'm not certain, she said. I'm prepared. Those aren't the same thing. She paused. But I've read enough financial cases from the cooperative's legal files to know what a strong filing looks like. This is a strong filing. He was quiet again. Then I need to tell you something. She waited. Before I agreed to your 30-day arrangement, he said, I thought you'd leave. He said it without inflection, just setting it down on the table like a tool he was done using. I thought the first real storm or the first real problem would end it. I've seen people come into this valley thinking it's something different from what it is. They don't usually last. I know you thought that. I wasn't kind about it in my own head. You were moderately kind about it in practice, she said. That's more than a lot of people manage. He almost smiled. Didn't quite. The point is, he continued, I stopped thinking it around day 14. Steer. She remembered the steer. The ground coming up, the breath knocked out, the way she'd gotten up anyway, and asked him to show her the fence section. What changed your mind, she asked. Not defensively. Just curious. You didn't make me feel like I needed to apologize for it, he said. For the steer. For not being there. You just moved forward. He paused, looking for the right words and not quite finding them. I've spent 8 months being someone people looked at with either pity or suspicion. You didn't look at me either of those ways. I looked at you like you were useful, she said.
Yeah.
He picked up his coffee cup. That was actually what I needed. Harlan Briggs arrived on the 30th of November, which was the 25th day since Adeline had moved to Cinder Ridge, and he arrived in a state of defensive fury that filled the porch yard before he'd fully dismounted. He was a compact, gray-haired man in his 50s with the kind of face that has been angry for a long time and forgotten what it looked like before. Ed Peterson was with him, which was the only reason Adeline opened the door and came out to the porch, because Peterson had warned her that Briggs would need to see a face he recognized before he'd agree to anything. You're the woman who bought Ronan's ranch, Briggs said. Not a greeting, an accusation in the shape of a sentence. I'm the woman who owns Cinder Ridge, she said evenly. Adeline Marlowe. You can be as angry about that as you want, mister. Briggs, but it won't change the deed. What it might change is what happens to Silas Vane. Briggs looked at Peterson. Peterson said, just listen to her. I've lost enough listening to people, Briggs said. You've lost enough not listening to the right ones, Adeline said. Come inside. I'll show you what I have. He came inside. He sat at the table with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and she showed him the case document and the Peterson and Marsh records and her own analysis of the deposit ledger gap. And she watched him the way. She watched difficult numbers without rushing the moment, letting the information do the work. The arms came uncrossed around page 7. By page 14, he was leaning forward with his elbows on the table. He didn't say anything for a long time when she finished. My east acreage, he said finally. The land dispute. It wasn't really a land dispute. No, she said. Based on what Ed's told me about the timeline, it appears Vane manufactured a boundary claim through a third party to create a legal cost burden he knew you couldn't sustain. You lost the acreage to the legal fees rather than to the underlying claim. She paused. Do you still have the original boundary survey? In a box somewhere. Find it, she said, and the court filing from the dispute. All of it. She met his eyes, because that's a different mechanism than the loan manipulation, which means it extends the pattern and makes the systematic nature of the fraud harder to dismiss as coincidental. Briggs was quiet. I can't pay for a lawyer, he said. Came out rough, like it cost him to say it. You won't need to, she said. You need to find the documents. I'll do the rest. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ronan, who'd been standing near the stove for the whole conversation, saying nothing. You trust her? Briggs asked him. Ronan considered it. Yeah, he said, I do. Briggs looked back at Adeline. Find the documents, he said. All right. He left the original boundary survey and the court filing copies 3 days later, pushed through the door by Cal Peterson, who'd been tasked with collecting them. Adeline added them to the case document over 2 evenings, extending the evidentiary narrative by 4 pages and adding a second fraud mechanism to the pattern analysis. The filing package was complete on December 3rd. The 30th day was December 7th. She'd known that was coming the way you know a weather system is coming, not because you can stop it, but because you can see its shape from a distance. She had not let herself think about it in the weeks of preparation, because thinking about it would have taken energy she needed for the work. But now the work was done, and the filing package was sealed and ready, and the 30th day was in 4 days, and she found herself at the east fence line in the late afternoon light, doing a task that didn't strictly need doing, walking the wire. Checking the posts because the house felt too small to think in. Ronan found her there. He didn't say anything immediately. He walked the section with her, checking the same posts, and the parallel attention of 2 people doing the same task in silence had a particular quality she'd become familiar with. You're thinking about the 30 days, he said. Yes. So am I. She stopped at the corner post and looked out at the north pasture. The steers were settled in the far corner, their backs to the wind. The well cover sat level and solid. The barn's north wall, invisible from here but solid in her mind, stood where it was supposed to stand. The filing goes out Tuesday, she said, regardless of anything else. I know, the case is strong. With all 6 properties documented and the deposit ledger analysis, Alderman will have enough to order a full financial review, and that's when she stopped. She was explaining things he already understood. She did that sometimes when she was avoiding something. She looked at him. I know what the filing does, he said. I've known since you started writing the case document. He paused. I'm not leaving on day 30. She was quiet. I know you haven't asked, he said. That's exactly why I'm telling you without being asked. He looked away at the pasture, then back. I don't have anywhere better to be, and I know this land. And the spring needs maintaining through winter, and the south barn face needs addressing after the thaw, and someone with actual cattle experience needs to be here when you expand the herd in spring, which you're going to need to do to make this operation financially sustainable, which I know because I ran cattle on this land for 23 years. That's a very practical set of reasons, she said. Yes. Is there an impractical one? He looked at her for a moment. I don't want to leave, he said. That's the impractical one. She turned back toward the fence line, her hands in her pockets. Filing goes out Tuesday, she said again, and then we wait. We've been good at that. We have, she agreed. The filing went out Tuesday. On Wednesday, Silas Vane appeared in Harwick at the land office in a conversation that was witnessed by the junior clerk and reported to Ed Peterson's son within the day. He was asking about the filing. His voice, the clerk said, had been controlled. His face had not been. On Thursday, a man Adeline didn't recognize rode slowly up the access track toward the ranch and sat on his horse at the property boundary for nearly 5 minutes before turning and riding back down. She watched him from the porch and did not go inside until he was gone. Then she wrote down the time and the description of the horse in her ledger. That's Decker, Ronan said, when she described the man at supper. He does odd work for Vane, deliveries, messages. He paused. Other things. He didn't cross the boundary. No. He was just establishing that they know we filed. Ronan's voice was flat. It's a message. I understand what it is, she said. She passed him the bread. Eat. He looked at her. You're not scared, he said. I'm scared, she corrected. I'm also eating supper. On Friday, a letter arrived from Vane's attorney in Harwick. It was written in the elevated, slightly threatening register that attorneys used when they wanted to suggest legal action without committing to specifics. It questioned the provenance of the Cinder Ridge survey documents, alleged that Adeline's case filing contained material misrepresentations, and strongly implied that pursuing this matter would expose her to significant personal legal liability. She read it twice. Then she added it to the evidentiary file as further evidence of Vane's awareness of and response to the fraud claims. She wrote that in her ledger under the date, attorney letter received. Vane's counsel aware of filing, added to evidentiary record demonstrates knowledge of claims and suggests defensive posture rather than confident position. She posted a copy of the letter to the sealed envelope addressed to the territorial governor's office with a dated addendum. 2 weeks after the filing, a letter arrived from Judge Alderman's clerk in Buffalo. She opened it, standing at the porch table, the way she always opened letters from unknown sources outside, in the light, where she couldn't be accused of being in the dark about anything. The hearing was set for January 15th. All parties were to present themselves at the territorial courthouse in Buffalo. The judge had reviewed the preliminary filing and was ordering production of Vane's loan ledgers and operating accounts under territorial subpoena, returnable to the court by January 10th. She read it a second time to make sure she'd understood the last part. The subpoena was already issued. She hadn't had to argue for it. The case document had been sufficient. She sat down on the porch step not gracefully, just suddenly needing to sit, and held the letter in both hands and looked at the yard. The snow was back, light and steady, covering the tracks from Decker's horse and the boot prints from the week's work and the ruts from the hay cart's last run. Everything under it clean and even. Ronan came out of the barn and crossed the yard toward her. He read her face at 3 feet. She could see him reading it, and he covered the remaining distance faster than his usual pace. She held up the letter. He took it, read it standing there in the snow, the flakes settling on his coat and the paper. He lowered it slowly. "The subpoena means," he said, and stopped, and started again. "The operating accounts are coming out. Under court order," she said, "which means his attorneys can't object to production without being in contempt. And once those accounts are in front of the court, the deposits will be there." His voice was very quiet. "Every payment, every one I made, every one we all made." "Corroborated by the receipts," she said. "Yes." He handed the letter back. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. "January 15th, he said. 5 weeks. He nodded, looked at the barn, the fence line, the eastern ridge in its gray winter light. "Cattle," he said. "If the case goes the way we expect, if Alderman finds in our favor, there'll be a judgment. Compensation for the fraudulent foreclosures. That's the standard remedy in documented fraud cases. Actual damages, which would include the assessed value of the property at foreclosure, and potentially the income lost during the intervening period." He was very still, Ronan, she said. He looked at her. "Court will likely offer you the ranch," she said. "You should know that ahead of time. A fraudulent foreclosure means the original transfer was invalid. Alderman will have to address that." She held his gaze steadily. "He'll probably offer you Cinder Ridge." The snow kept falling between them. "What will you do?" he said. His voice had gone careful in a way she recognized the careful of a man who had learned not to hope for things too quickly. "I'll tell the truth," she said. "I'll tell him I bought the property legally and paid for it and worked it, and I've put every dollar and every day I had into keeping it alive." She paused. "And then I'll tell him the rest." "What's the rest?" She looked at the ranch, the barn, the well, the fence line, the pasture. "That it shouldn't go back to being one person's," she said. "Not mine alone and not yours alone, because one person alone is exactly what he counted on. One person alone is what made all of you vulnerable in the first place." She looked back at him. "A water cooperative. The Springs access structured as a shared resource across the valley ranches, with a cooperative agreement that can't be bought or manipulated by a single speculator because no single party holds control." She paused. "I've been drafting the agreement structure for 2 weeks." Ronan stared at her. "You've been drafting a cooperative agreement," he said. "In the evenings." After the case document, she shrugged slightly. "I had the legal precedents from the cooperative's old files in Cheyenne. The structure isn't complicated. The hard part is getting people to sign on to it. Marsh Briggs, they all have water access problems. Cinder Ridge has the spring. If we structure the access agreement correctly, fixed rights, fixed costs, governed by the member ranches collectively rather than any individual or outside party, then no banker or speculator can ever replicate what Vane did, because the water is owned in common and the terms are legally fixed. It was quiet for a long time. The snow was heavier now, the ridge invisible, the yard defined by lamplight from the window, and the faint gray that came from everywhere and nowhere in a heavy Wyoming snowfall. "You bought a broken ranch for $1, he said finally, and you're going to turn it into the thing that keeps a whole valley of ranchers alive." "We are," she said, "if you'll help me explain it to Peterson and Marsh and Briggs, because they trust you in ways they don't trust me yet." He looked at her with the expression she'd first seen in the barn on her first night, trying to understand what she actually was, but it had changed considerably since then. There was less confusion in it now, and more of something else, something that didn't have a clean name. "My grandfather would have liked you," he said. She looked away because it landed harder than she'd expected. "Don't tell me that when I'm trying to be practical," she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, actually almost. "What do we do between now and January 15th, he said. "We keep the ranch running," she said. "We keep the livestock alive and the spring flowing and the fence sound. We don't give him anything to point to." She stood up from the porch step and brushed the snow off her coat. "And you write to everyone who's coming to that hearing and tell them to arrive a day early so we can review the document order together before we walk into that courthouse." She stopped at the door. "We get through winter," she said. She went inside. He stood in the yard for a moment in the snow, looking at the eastern ridge where the spring ran underneath, invisible and continuous, cold and certain. Then he went to finish the evening feeding. Inside, Adeline opened her ledger. Day 30 had come and gone 3 days ago, and neither of them had mentioned it. She wrote the date at the top of a clean page and did not write the day number because they weren't counting days anymore. She wrote, "Hearing set, January 15th, Buffalo. Alderman presiding." Then she wrote, "Spring running. Fence sound, livestock stable, case complete." Then, after a pause, in smaller writing at the bottom of the page, almost like she was writing it for herself rather than for the record, "He stayed." She closed the ledger. Outside, the snow kept falling on Cinder Ridge, steady and impartial, covering everything equally, the repaired fence posts, and the rebuilt barn wall, and the level well cover, and the tracks that led from the house to the barn and back again, 2 sets of them, side by side in the white. The road to Buffalo took 2 days in January. Adeline had made the arrangements in the first week of the new year, a hired wagon for herself and Ronan, rooms at a boarding house on the main street that Francis Alcott had recommended in a follow-up letter, and confirmation from Ed Peterson that he, Cal, Will Marsh, and Harlan Briggs would arrive the evening of January 14th, a day ahead of the hearing, as she'd asked. The night before they left Cinder Ridge, she couldn't sleep. She lay on her pallet in the dark and listened to the ranch, the wind, the distant sound of the steers shifting in the north pasture, the particular creak of the barn's south corner that she'd learned to distinguish from all the other sounds a working structure makes at night. She knew those sounds now the way she knew her own handwriting. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected to know a place this well, this fast. But that was what happened when you worked a piece of ground with your hands. Every day it stopped being property and started being something else, something without a clean, legal word for it. She thought about what she'd told Ronan at the fence line, that a place belongs to you because you know it. She'd said it back to him as a truth, but it had been his truth first, his grandfather's truth, and she'd found herself living inside it without quite meaning to. She got up at 4 in the morning and checked the stove and wrote 3 pages of notes she didn't strictly need. And when Ronan came in from the barn at first light, she had coffee ready and the wagon provisions packed and the evidentiary case in its oilcloth wrapping inside her traveling trunk. And he looked at all of this and said nothing except, "Ready?" "Ready," she said. The road to Buffalo was cold and mostly silent, which suited them both. They'd gotten good at shared silence, the kind that wasn't avoidance, but simply 2 people occupying the same space, without requiring it to mean anything beyond that. She watched the territory pass and thought about the case. He drove and watched the road and thought about whatever he thought about in long silences. Once, somewhere in the second hour, he said, "The south barn face after the thaw, I want to address it before the spring rains." And she said, "It's in the ledger." And he said, Good, and they didn't speak again for another hour, and it wasn't uncomfortable. They arrived in Buffalo in the late afternoon of the 14th. The boarding house was clean and plain and run by a woman named Mrs. Cord, who asked no questions and provided good food, which were exactly the two qualities Adeline needed from a boarding house in January. Ed Peterson and Cal were already there when they arrived. Will Marsh came in an hour later, and Harlan Briggs, to everyone's mild surprise, came in before supper with his boundary survey under his arm and a look on his face that said he'd made a decision somewhere on the road and wasn't planning to revisit it. They met in the boarding house's front room after supper, 5 of them around a table that wasn't quite big enough, and Adeline walked them through the order of the case presentation. She'd learned in 7 years of bookkeeping for a public institution that preparation was the thing that separated people who prevailed in formal proceedings from people who didn't. Not brilliance, not luck. Preparation, knowing what you had, knowing how it was organized, knowing the sequence in which you'd present it so that each piece built on the last and the pattern was clear before the judge had to ask for clarification. She'd prepared. Alderman will open by establishing the nature of the proceeding, she said. This is an administrative fraud hearing, not a criminal trial. He's evaluating evidence and determining whether the territorial court has grounds to order further action financial restitution, voiding of fraudulent instruments, referral to criminal court if the evidence supports it. She looked around the table. He'll ask each of us to establish our standing, who we are, and what our relationship to the claims is. Keep that short and factual. Name property, the nature of your loss. And then the documents, Ed Peterson said. Then the documents. I'll present the consolidated case first, the pattern analysis, the deposit ledger argument, the survey record. Then each of you presents your individual documentation in the order I've listed. She'd typed up the order on a card for each of them. Do not add to it. Do not editorialize. If Alderman has questions, answer them directly. If you don't know the answer, say so. She paused. Vane's attorneys will be there. They'll try to introduce doubt about the document provenance and the chain of custody. I've written a provenance statement for each document cluster. In the filing, if challenged, you reference the statement. Will Marsh said, has Vane produced the operating accounts under the subpoena? His attorneys submitted them on January 9th, Adeline said. Clerk's office sent me a confirmation. She paused. They submitted them. The table went quiet. They submitted them, Ronan said.
Yes.
Which means either they're clean and he's confident or they're not. And he calculated that non-compliance with a court subpoena would be worse than production. She looked at Ronan steadily. I believe it's the second. A man who is confident in his records doesn't send an attorney's threatening letter 2 days after a filing. He waits. Harlan Briggs said, you don't know what's in them yet. No, I'll see them for the first time when Alderman enters them into evidence. She folded her hands on the table. But I've been reading financial records for 7 years, and I know what I'm looking for, and I know where it will be if it's there. She paused. I believe it will be there. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. You've been right about everything else, he said. It wasn't quite a compliment. It was a man who'd learned not to give compliments, easily acknowledging a fact. So far, she said, get some sleep, all of you. She didn't sleep much herself. The territorial courthouse in Buffalo was a 2-story stone building that smelled of wood oil and cold paper, and the accumulated authority of decisions made within its walls over many years. They arrived at 8 in the morning, 45 minutes before the hearing, because Adeline wanted to see the room before Vane's people did. They were not the first. Vane was already there. He was standing near the window on the far side of the room with 2 men she didn't recognize attorneys, by their dress and their manner, the studied confidence of men whose job was to appear unruffled. Vane himself was well dressed, as always, and his face was composed with the practiced smoothness of a man who'd been in difficult rooms before and understood that composure was its own form of argument. He looked at Adeline when she entered. She looked back. Neither of them spoke. Greer was there, 2 thinner than she'd imagined him, from Ronan's descriptions, with ink-stained fingers and the eyes of a man who'd been awake for several nights, doing his own calculations. He didn't look at anyone directly. Alderman arrived at precisely 8:45. He was a large man in his 60s with a gray beard and no observable interest in ceremony. He came in, sat down, looked at both sides of the room with the equanimity of someone who'd seen a great many disputes and had formed no romantic notions about any of them, and said, let's begin. First hour was procedural. Alderman established standing for each party, confirmed the subpoena compliance, and entered the case filing and all supporting documents into the record. He did this without theatrics, moving through the process with the efficiency of a man who valued his time and expected others to value it likewise. Then he turned to Adeline. "Miss Marlowe," he said, "your filing is the originating complaint. Present your consolidated analysis." She stood up. She had 22 pages. She presented the essential architecture of them in 12 minutes, moving through the pattern analysis, the deposit ledger argument, and the survey record without hesitation or embellishment. She cited document numbers. She referenced specific page and entry numbers in the evidentiary inventory. When she referenced the deposit ledger argument, the core of it, the place where the numbers either held or didn't, she spoke slowly and watched Alderman's face. He was writing. When she finished, he said, without looking up, "The deposit ledger discrepancy you've described. You're asserting that payments erased from the loan record will appear as deposits in the operating account." "Yes, Your Honor. And you believe the subpoenaed accounts will show this?" "I believe the mathematics require it, unless the operating accounts have also been adjusted." She paused. "Which would be a separate offense of greater severity." Alderman looked up at her. "Sit down, Miss Marlowe." He looked at Vane's lead attorney, a man named Cartwell who had the kind of composed, expensive face that matched his client's. "Mr. Cartwell, the operating accounts." Cartwell stood. He spoke for 6 minutes, which was 5 minutes and 40 seconds longer than he needed to. And what he said amounted to, the accounts were submitted under protest. The subpoena was of questionable scope. The documents in Miss Marlowe's filing were of uncertain provenance, and his client categorically denied any fraudulent intent. Alderman listened to all of it with the patience of a man who'd been listening to attorneys for 30 years and had learned to identify the exact moment when language stopped carrying information and started carrying only noise. When Cartwell finished, Alderman said the subpoena was properly issued and compliance was legally required. Objections to scope are noted for the record and denied. The accounts will be entered as submitted. He looked at Adeline. "Miss Marlowe, the operating accounts, can you work from them now?" She'd been hoping he'd ask. "Yes, Your Honor." The clerk brought the account's 3 bound ledger volumes to her table. She opened the first one and found the date range she needed, and she worked the way she always worked with numbers, which was to let the structure of the document show her where the information lived before she started looking for specific entries. It took her 4 minutes to understand the account's organization. Then she started cross-referencing against Ronan's receipts. The first match took 30 seconds. Payment receipt dated March 14, 1,886, amount of $3.40, signed by Greer. Operating account entry dated March 15, 1,886, 1 day later. The standard processing delay, $3.40, received, entered under a general account heading that was, by its nature, harder to trace than a specific loan account entry. But the amount and the date were there. She found 11 of Ronan's 12 erased payments in the operating accounts within 40 minutes. The 12th was in the 3rd volume, filed under a slightly different account heading, but the amount and date matched the receipt. All 12. She looked up from the ledgers. "Your Honor," she said. "All 12 of Mr. Hale's erased payments appear in the operating accounts with corresponding dates. I can provide the specific entry references for each." The room was very quiet. Alderman looked at Cartwell. Cartwell's composed face had developed a fault line somewhere in the last 40 minutes. He said, "Your Honor, the account entries don't," and Alderman held up one hand, and he stopped. "Mr. Cartwell," Alderman said, "I'm going to ask your client's loan manager, Mr. Greer, some questions." What followed was 25 minutes that Adeline would never forget. Not because it was dramatic in the way stories made dramatic things raised voices, sudden confessions, theatrical reversals, but because it was the opposite of that. It was quiet and methodical and devastating in the way that arithmetic is devastating when the numbers simply don't match, and there's nowhere left to put the difference. Alderman asked Greer about each erased payment. Greer attempted at first to maintain that the receipts had been issued in error. Alderman showed him the operating account entries. Greer attempted to argue that the account entries didn't correspond to the specific loans. Alderman asked him to explain how $3.40 deposited on March 15 $1,886. The day after a loan payment receipt for the same amount was signed could be anything other than that payment. Greer couldn't. By the end of it, Greer had stopped looking at Vane. Alderman recessed for 1 hour. When he came back, he was carrying a separate sheet of notes that he'd written during the recess, and his expression had the quality of a man who has come to a clear conclusion and is now in the procedural business of stating it. He found for the plaintiffs on all primary claims. The fraudulent loan manipulation was established by the deposit account evidence. Foreclosures conducted on the basis of those manufactured defaults were void as instruments of fraud. The affected property owners were entitled to damages assessed at the fair market value of their losses, plus recovery of all payments made under the fraudulent loan terms. For Ronan specifically, the fraudulent foreclosure of Cinder Ridge was declared invalid. Then Alderman looked at Ronan directly. "Mr. Hale," he said, "the fraudulent nature of your foreclosure means the original transfer of your property was invalid. The court would be within its authority to order restoration of the deed to your name." He paused. "Miss Marlowe purchased the property in good faith at a lawful auction and has maintained it under considerable hardship. Court will hear your preference." Ronan stood up. He stood the way he stood when he was working straight, without performance, a man occupying his own body without apology. He didn't look at Vane, he looked at Alderman. "Cinder Ridge belongs to Adeline Marlowe," he said. "She bought it legally. She kept it alive when no one else believed it was worth keeping. I accept the financial compensation for the fraudulent foreclosure and the cancellation of the debt." He paused. "The ranch stays hers." Adeline looked at her hands on the table. She didn't trust what her face was doing. Alderman looked at her. "Miss Marlowe, any objection?" She looked up. "No, Your Honor." Her voice was steady. "However, I'd like to submit an additional document for the court's consideration." She'd been carrying it in her coat pocket since they left Cinder Ridge. It was the cooperative agreement, 6 pages, carefully written, structuring the Cinder Ridge spring access as a shared resource across the participating valley ranches with fixed terms, collective governance, and a legal structure that prevented any single party from acquiring controlling interest. It included signature lines for Adeline Marlowe, Ronan Hale, Ed Peterson, Will Marsh, and Harlan Briggs, all of whom had read it and discussed it, though she hadn't told any of them she'd be presenting it here. She submitted it to the clerk. Alderman read it. It took him 4 minutes. He was a fast reader. He looked at the room at Peterson and Marsh and Briggs, who were reading the document over each other's shoulders with expressions that moved from surprise to recognition to something more complicated and slower. "This is a private cooperative agreement," Alderman said. "Outside the court's jurisdiction to impose." "Yes, Your Honor." "I'm not asking the court to impose it. I'm asking for the court's acknowledgement that such an agreement, if signed voluntarily, would be consistent with the equitable resolution of the water access claims." She paused. "And I'm asking whether the parties present would be willing to sign it today, before we leave this building." The room was quiet for a moment. Ed Peterson said, "Without standing, I'll sign it." Will Marsh said, "So will I." Harlan Briggs looked at the document for a long moment. Then he said, "Yeah, all right." Ronan was looking at her with the expression she'd stopped trying to name. He said, "You wrote this 3 weeks ago." 2.5, she said. "And you waited until now to show them." "I needed them to trust the case first," she said. "The agreement only works if people choose it, not if they're talked into it before they know whether they can trust the person proposing it." He was quiet. "Sign it, Ronan," she said. He reached across the table for her pen and signed his name. Vane's attorneys filed 3 motions in the weeks following the hearing. All 3 were denied. His land acquisition company was referred to the Territorial Attorney General's office for a broader investigation into its practices across the territory, which, as Adeline had anticipated, extended considerably beyond the Harwick Valley. Greer cooperated with the investigation. The nature of that cooperation and what it revealed about the full scope of Vane's operation was a matter of territorial record, and the record did not reflect well on Silas Vane. He did not go to prison. Men like Vane, in 1,888 Wyoming, rarely did. But his land holdings were subject to civil judgments that took years to fully resolve, and his ability to operate in the territory contracted sharply and then effectively ended. The last anyone in the Harwick Valley heard of him directly, he'd moved his operation to Colorado. Whether Colorado proved more accommodating was a matter of ongoing speculation among people who'd once lost sleep over his name. Greer lost his position and his license to practice as a loan agent in the territory. He moved, too, in a different direction and took his ink-stained fingers with him. The financial restitution took 8 months to process fully. Peterson and Marsh received amounts that allowed them to stabilize their reduced operations. Briggs recovered enough to reclaim a portion of his east acreage through a separate proceeding that his boundary survey made straightforward. The other affected ranchers, the ones whose cases had been referenced in the pattern analysis without their direct participation in the hearing, were contacted by the Territorial Attorney General's office individually. Ronan received $212. He put $140 of it toward breeding stock 6 heifers and a bull from a reputable operation north of Casper, and the remainder into a repair fund for the ranch's most pressing structural needs, beginning with the south barn face that he'd been noting since November. He did not reclaim ownership of Cinder Ridge. He never mentioned it again. What he did in the months after the hearing was work. He worked the way he'd always worked, thoroughly, without theater, with the particular competence of a man who knew what he was doing and didn't need to announce it. He rebuilt the south barn face in March, during the first dry week after the thaw, with Cal Peterson's help and 2 days of weather that cooperated just enough to be useful before turning bad again. He managed the spring herd expansion with the careful eye that Adeline trusted completely because he'd been proved right about livestock decisions every single time she'd questioned them and had been wrong. She ran the books and the correspondence and the cooperative accounts and the ongoing legal correspondence with the Territorial Attorney General's office, and she managed the relationships with Peterson and Marsh and Briggs in the cooperative framework, and she wrote every transaction and decision and outcome in the ledger with the same precision she'd brought to everything since the beginning. The cooperative agreement was signed and filed with the Territorial Land Office in March, properly witnessed and recorded. Under its terms, the spring access was governed collectively, with each participating ranch holding a fixed share of usage rights and a voice in any decisions about access modification. The agreement could not be sold or transferred individually. A single buyer could not acquire control of the cooperative by purchasing one ranch, because ownership of a ranch did not automatically transfer its cooperative membership that required separate collective approval from the other members. It was, as Adeline had designed it, effectively resistant to the mechanism Vane had used. Ed Peterson, at the first cooperative meeting held at Cinder Ridge in April, sat at the table where Adeline had once laid out 22 pages of fraud documentation and said, "My father would have given anything for something like this 30 years ago. A lot of things would have been different 30 years ago," Adeline said. "We can only work with now." Peterson looked at her. "How'd you get so practical?" he said, not critically. "Genuinely curious. I learned it from necessity," she said. "And then I decided it was better than the alternative." The following autumn, not quite a year from the day Adeline had climbed down from Cobb's wagon, in the mud Ronan Hale asked her to marry him. He did not do it grandly. He was not a grand gesture man, and she was not a grand gesture woman, and they both knew this about each other well enough that a grand gesture would have felt like wearing someone else's clothes. He did it in the barn, of all places, which was where he did most of his thinking, late in the afternoon when the light came in sideways through the gaps and made everything look like it was worth more than it was. She was checking the feed store inventory, and he was mending a bridle that had been mending for 3 days, because every time he picked it up, something more urgent needed doing first. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. I've been trying to ask it for about 6 weeks." She looked up from the inventory. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You knew. You kept starting sentences and then redirecting them to fence posts or feed costs." She set down her pencil. "I was waiting." "For what?" "For you to figure out how." He set the bridle down. "I don't have a ring," he said. "I could get one, but I didn't want to get one, and then have you say no and have a ring sitting around being an awkward object." "That's practical," she said. "I'm not good at speeches." "I know that too. I want to stay here," he said. "Not as an employee and not as a partner in the business sense, though I want that too." He stopped. "Start it again. You're the most capable and most difficult and most worth-knowing person I've met in 35 years. And this is my family's land and your land, and I don't want to divide those things anymore. I want them to be the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. Ask me properly, she said. Adeline Marlowe, he said. Will you marry me? He didn't say it like a question. He said it the way he said most important things directly, without the upward inflection that turns a statement into a plea. She'd noticed this about him from early on. He stated things as facts he was hoping for, rather than questions he was afraid to hear answered. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. He looked at her. Obviously, he said. You've been here for 10 months, Ronan. What did you think I was going to say? I didn't know. You're hard to predict. I'm completely consistent, she said. You just have to understand the system. He almost laughed. This time it actually happened, a real laugh, brief and genuine, and it changed his face in a way she hadn't seen before and hoped to see again. They married in November, 1 year, and a few weeks after she'd first lit a lantern and walked into a barn to find a homeless man sleeping in her hay. The ceremony was Small Peterson and his son, Will Marsh, Harlan Briggs, and a justice of the peace from Harwick, who drove out to the property because Adeline had asked him to, and he'd agreed because he'd heard enough about what had happened at the Alderman, hearing to feel that the trip was worth making. They married under the restored beam of the old barn, the north wall that Ronan had reinforced in freezing rain in the second week, the wall she'd heard him working on from the house, and understood, even then, was a man repairing something he needed to matter. No one made long speeches. Ed Peterson said something brief that was better than brief speeches usually were, and Will Marsh shook Ronan's hand for a long time without words, and Harlan Briggs gave Adeline a look that carried more sentiment than he'd probably intended, and then looked at something else quickly. Afterwards, they had supper at the long table that had replaced the three-legged one, all of them crowded in, and the conversation has the kind that happens between people who've been through something real, together, not the polished social conversation of strangers, but the rougher, warmer kind, full of references to specific moments and hard days, and the occasional thing that was just funny in the way that hard things become funny once enough time has passed. Cinder Ridge survived that winter, and the one after, and the one after that. The breeding stock Ronan had purchased proved sound. 2 of the 6 heifers were exceptional, producing calves that strengthened the herd measurably over 3 seasons. The spring supplied the cooperative members through 2 drought years that hit the broader region hard, and in the second of those drought years, 3 additional ranches applied to join the cooperative, and Adeline spent 6 weeks renegotiating the access terms to accommodate them while maintaining the integrity of the structure she'd designed. Peterson said, at the 3rd cooperative meeting, that the valley had more water security than it had had in 20 years. Adeline said that wasn't particularly high praise given what the last 20 years had looked like. Peterson said that was fair. 3 years after the hearing, the Valley ranchers elected Adeline to oversee the cooperative accounts. This was not a formal office. It was the informal authority that develops when people watch someone handle money honestly and competently over a long period of time and decide they'd rather have that person managing the shared resources than argue about it. She kept the accounts the way she kept everything precisely, transparently, with a record accessible to any member who wanted to see it. Ronan became, by a similarly informal process, the man struggling ranchers went to before they went to a bank. He didn't advertise this. He simply had a reputation for knowing which operations were sound and which were wishful thinking, and for telling you which one yours was without cruelty, but without false comfort either. More than once he identified a contract term that was predatory before a rancher had signed it, and twice he went with someone to meet a creditor, and the creditor's behavior changed noticeably when Ronan was in the room, because word travels in a valley about the kind of man who walked evidence of fraud into a territorial court and didn't flinch. It was Ronan who gave her the silver dollar. 4 years after the auction, she was 35, he was 39. And Cinder Ridge had a sound roof and a full herd and a spring that had not once failed them. He came in from the barn on a Thursday evening and set something on the table beside her ledger. It was a silver dollar, framed in a small rectangle of wood that he'd clearly made himself, because the joinery was careful and practical and entirely without decorative ambition, which was exactly like him. She picked it up. For the most expensive $1 ranch in Wyoming, he said. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at him. You know, she said, I've thought about that day. The auction. She set the frame down. I was terrified. I don't think I've told you that. I sat in that auction room, and the bid was $1. and no one else bid. And I thought, I'm either about to make the best decision of my life or the worst one, and I genuinely cannot tell which. Which was it? He said. She looked at the framed dollar. Both, she said. It was the worst decision that turned into the best one. That's a different category from either. He sat down across from her. The ranch cost $1, she said, and then it cost everything else. Worth it, he said. She looked at him, this man she'd found sleeping in her barn, this man who'd carried a wrong for 8 months and kept his receipts anyway, this man who'd built and repaired and showed rather than done for her, this man who'd stood up in a courthouse and given away the thing he'd spent his whole life on because he'd decided it belonged to someone who'd earned it. She'd learned, in the years since that November, that the most important things were rarely the things you could document. The ledger told you what happened. It didn't tell you what it cost and what it made and what it changed in you by the time you reached the far side of it. The ledger told you the ranch was worth $1 on December 1st, 1888. It didn't tell you what it was worth the morning she'd wrapped Ronan's hand in linen, or the night they'd all stood in the dark clearing creek-bottom stone from a blocked channel in freezing rain, or the moment she'd heard a real laugh from him for the first time and understood she'd been waiting for it without knowing she was waiting. Some of the most important things in a life don't fit in a ledger. You can know that and still believe in ledgers. She did. She believed in records and documentation and the discipline of writing things down. Also understood, in a way she hadn't entirely understood when she'd climbed down from Cobb's wagon with her provisions trunk and her $64 and her absolute refusal to turn around, that the things worth having were not the things you could buy. They were the things you stayed for. Worth it, she said. She picked up the framed dollar and looked at it one more time. No, she said, correcting herself. The ranch cost $1. She set it back on the table and took his hand across the ledger. Saving it cost us everything we had, she said. That's different. Outside, the pasture was green in the late afternoon, the grass that had been dead when she arrived, the fences that had been down, the well that had been poisoned, the barn that had been leaning. All of it different now. Not perfect. Nothing was perfect. The south barn face would need attention again after this winter, and the cooperative accounts had a dispute in them that she'd been working through for 3 weeks. And 2 of the herd's older cows were going to need decisions made about them before spring. There was always something. That was the nature of a working place. There was always the next thing, the next repair, the next season, the next problem that needed meeting. But the spring was running under the eastern ridge, steady and cold and continuous, exactly where Marshall Hale had bored for it in 1849 and written it down in a careful hand so that no one could say it wasn't there. And Cinder Ridge, which had belonged to 3 generations, and then a bank, and then a woman with $1 and more stubbornness than sense, was still standing. Still standing, still watered, still worked by 2 people who had found each other in the worst possible circumstances, and stayed anyway, not because it was easy. Not because they were the kind of people who made things look easy, but because the hardest thing and the right thing had turned out, against all reasonable expectation, to be the same thing. That was the part no ledger could hold, but Adeline knew it. She had written it, once, at the bottom of a page in small letters, almost like she was writing it for herself. He stayed, and so had she.